Hey guys, tonight we're stepping softly into a palace unlike anything you've seen, where polished marble floors glisten with torchlight, and the air tastes faintly of honeyed wine and lotus blossoms drifting in golden bowls of water. You're walking through a corridor lined with carved columns shaped like papyrus reeds, and every step echoes as if the stone itself is whispering secrets. This is Alexandria in the time of Cleopatra, and tonight your dreams have brought you into her court just as the sun drops behind the horizon. The Nile glows like molten copper outside the windows, and servants move in perfect rhythm, lighting oil lamps one by one until the palace shimmers like a constellation come to earth. You probably won't survive the sheer weight of the perfumes alone. One whiff of frankincense, myrrh, and the rare cinnamon imported from India, and your modern lungs would probably faint from sensory overload. But Cleopatra? She thrives in this mixture of luxury and smoke, because every particle of her world is chosen carefully to create a performance of power. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you are right now and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The evening in Cleopatra's palace is a play staged for both herself and anyone watching. You wander deeper into the hall where jeweled lamps flicker, their brass holders engraved with Egyptian hieroglyphs and Greek letters side by side, reminding you that Cleopatra is not just a queen, but the last pharaoh of a hybrid dynasty. Her Ptolemaic bloodline traces back to Macedonian Greece, yet she rules Egypt as if it flows through her veins like the Nile. Servants bow as she enters, her gown of indigo linen catching the lamplight with threads of gold. The fabric clings lightly to her shoulders, and you notice her crown, a diadem, not the towering double crown of earlier pharaohs, glimmering with garnets and pearls. Mainstream fact: Cleopatra wasn't only the last pharaoh of Egypt, she was also the only one of her dynasty known to actually learn and speak Egyptian. Most of her ancestors stuck with Greek, which was their cultural comfort zone, but Cleopatra understood that to rule a land as proud as Egypt, you had to breathe its language. Imagine how astonishing it must have been for Egyptian priests and farmers alike to hear their ruler speaking directly to them in their native tongue after centuries of foreign rulers sounding like strangers. The night around you vibrates with music. Lyres plucked softly, reed flutes humming in low notes that slither like snakes through the chamber. The smell of roasted duck wafts in, mingling with candied dates and fresh figs. At her banquets, Cleopatra is famous not just for the food but for the theater of it all. Quirky tidbit: she once supposedly dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar and drank it, just to win a bet about who could host the most expensive dinner. Tonight, though, she is more subtle. The platters shine under the lamplight, and servants carry golden cups filled with watered wine, chilled in jars buried in cool sand. You take your place at the edge, trying not to intrude, but Cleopatra's eyes, sharp, lined with kohl, their corners winged into feline precision, scan the room with such command that you feel she notices you anyway. She doesn't need words. Her presence alone tells you that this is her stage. Her movements are deliberate, like a dancer who has rehearsed every step since childhood. When she lifts her hand, bangles clink softly like tiny bells. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's greatest strength lay in her beauty or in her wit. Ancient Roman writers, many of them hostile, claim she bewitched men with her looks alone, but fragments of Egyptian inscriptions and later Arab chronicles suggest something else, that her intelligence and charisma were far more potent than any eyeliner could ever be. You feel this now, just standing in the glow of her presence. It's not about her face, though it's luminous. It's about the way she makes silence feel like anticipation and conversation feel like prophecy. Outside, the Nile reflects the stars, and a breeze stirs the woven curtains. You imagine the ships tied at her harbor, their sails folded like resting wings, waiting for orders that might carry them across the Mediterranean to Rome, Cyprus, or beyond. Cleopatra's Egypt is a crossroads of worlds, and her palace is its glittering heart. She lifts a cup and tastes her wine, eyes lingering on the horizon. Maybe she's thinking of Caesar in Rome, maybe of her child asleep in the nursery, or maybe just of the tides that will one day wash her name into every language. You wonder, in this moment, if she feels the weight of history or only the softness of silk against her skin. Joke 1. You're pretty sure if Netflix existed in her day, she'd cancel any Roman senator's subscription just out of spite. Joke 2. The way she manages to combine perfume, politics, and jewelry all in one evening is basically the original multitasking queen. Joke 3. When you glance at the piles of figs and honey cakes, you realize Cleopatra probably invented the first all-you-can-eat buffet, except instead of a sneeze guard, you'd get a priest's curse if you grabbed too much. As the night deepens, you catch yourself leaning into the rhythm of her world. The torches flicker lower, the air grows warmer, and somewhere in the distance, a priest sings a hymn to Isis. Cleopatra's head tilts, her lips curve into the faintest smile, and you feel as though you've entered not just her palace, but her mind, a place of strategy, charm, and relentless theater. The scene closes with her rising from the table, moving toward a balcony overlooking the Nile. The night wind plays in her hair, carrying incense into the sky, and she stands there like a figure carved into eternity. In that silence, you know you've only just begun this long, strange journey beside her. The night lingers heavy as you drift further into the palace, following Cleopatra's shadow as it stretches across mosaic floors of turquoise and alabaster. The banquet has dissolved into quiet laughter and the occasional clink of cups, but Cleopatra herself has already slipped into another rhythm, one reserved for rulers who cannot afford to rest. You trail her down a corridor lined with painted panels, scenes of lotus flowers bending toward the Nile, falcons in flight, gods stretching their hands toward mortals. Each panel whispers of legacy, and you sense she knows this walk is itself a kind of performance. You find yourself in her private library, a chamber that hums with quiet authority. The shelves, carved from cedar and inlaid with ivory, hold papyrus scrolls rolled tight like sleeping snakes. The scent of ink and beeswax lingers in the air, and faint lamplight reveals faint dust motes twirling as though time itself drifts here. This is a queen who does not only rule with gold and armies, she rules with words, knowledge, and the dangerous sharpness of thought. Mainstream fact: Cleopatra was famously well-educated, trained in philosophy, mathematics, rhetoric, astronomy, and medicine. She grew up in the Ptolemaic court, where learning was prized, and as part of her grooming for rule, she had access to the Library of Alexandria, the most celebrated archive of the ancient world. You imagine her here not just a queen, but a student unrolling papyri about stars, herbs, and histories, committing them to memory until her mind became a fortress stronger than any stone wall. She seats herself at a low table, the wood darkened with age, and gestures for a scribe to bring fresh scrolls. Her fingers trace Greek letters first, flowing and precise, then shift into Egyptian hieroglyphs, each symbol carved by centuries of tradition. She switches between tongues as effortlessly as you might switch between apps on your phone, except her choices carry the weight of entire nations. Quirky tidbit: ancient writers claimed Cleopatra could speak at least 9 languages, making her not just a polyglot but a walking translation device centuries before Google Translate. The thought makes you grin because you can almost hear her sigh if you dared to speak only English in her court. Really, one language? How quaint. How? Her scribe, a young man with ink-stained fingers, leans in as she dictates. Her words are quick, steady, measured, plans for trade routes, notes on Egyptian rituals, reminders to send offerings to temples. Then she pauses, dipping her stylus into a dish of black ink, and adds a line in her own hand. Her script is firm, and you realize she doesn't just command knowledge, she leaves a trail of it. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra ever personally wrote treatises on medicine or philosophy, or whether those attributed to her were penned by court scholars in her name. Some fragments suggest she experimented with herbal remedies, even testing poisons to see their effects. Others dismiss these as dramatic tales woven by later chroniclers who couldn't imagine a queen dipping her fingers into science. You watch her now, the faint furrow between her brows as she writes, and you know she is not content to let others do the thinking for her. The room grows quiet, except for the faint scratching of reed pens. Outside, the cicadas buzz against the dark Nile air. You lean back against the wall, your eyes tracing the golden flicker of lamp flames across her bracelets. She seems more alive here than at the banquet, her laughter replaced by a still, steady intensity that makes you feel she could pierce through any mask. Joke 1. You wonder if she'd have been the terror of a modern trivia night, sweeping every category and then sipping her wine as though it were obvious. Joke 2. If she had access to Wikipedia, she'd probably correct half the articles herself before breakfast. Joke 3. You picture her using Duolingo, except the owl would bow and apologize because she already speaks every language better than it does. She leans over another scroll, this one a star chart with tiny dots inked into constellations. Her finger traces Orion, then Sirius, then the curve of the Great Bear. Astronomy wasn't just a hobby, it was essential for navigation, agriculture, and rituals. She murmurs to her scribe about the coming flood of the Nile, which farmers rely on for planning. It hits you that this queen, often remembered for her romances with Caesar and Antony, is in truth immersed in the mathematics of survival. A gust of wind slips through the latticed window, carrying the faint perfume of lotus blossoms from the garden. She closes her eyes, inhales, and for a fleeting second she looks less like a ruler and more like a woman savoring a private breath of calm. You catch yourself envying her serenity, though you know it's a mask layered over storms of responsibility. The lamp sputters, and she rises, placing the scroll back on its shelf with reverence. The cedar shelves creak faintly as though sighing under the weight of knowledge. She turns her gaze toward you, or maybe just toward the shadows, and in that gaze you see her truth. Not just beauty, not just charm, but an intellect sharpened to a weapon's edge. Outside, a servant coughs softly, signaling that another audience waits for her. Cleopatra straightens, smoothing her gown, the queen once more. The scholars tucked away, hidden behind the glimmer of gold and coal, but you know she'll return to these scrolls the first chance she gets. The night presses on, the palace hums, and you follow her steps out of the library, realizing you've just witnessed the heart of her power, a mind that refuses to be ordinary. The moon hangs pale over Alexandria as Cleopatra steps into another chamber, this one scented less of ink and more of crushed herbs and honey. The walls shimmer with painted lotus, their blue petals curling against golden reeds, and shelves here do not hold scrolls but jars, terracotta, alabaster, glass, each labeled with symbols that only the trained eye can untangle. You've entered her apothecary, a place of experiment and danger disguised as refinement. Your nose twitches at the mingled aromas, sharp vinegar, sweet myrrh, bitter frankincense, something musky that makes you cough before you can disguise it. Cleopatra lifts a small vial, tips it toward the lamplight, and the liquid within glows faintly amber. Her bracelets chime as she sets it down, her expression unreadable. You realize she is not only a queen of courtly spectacle, but also a queen of potions, willing to touch the raw edge of life and death. Mainstream fact, Cleopatra was deeply interested in pharmacology and medicine. Ancient accounts say she studied how herbs, minerals, and even animal parts could be used for healing, or for more sinister ends. Roman writers claimed she tested venoms on condemned prisoners to observe which were swift, which were slow, and which left the body calmest in death. You shiver at the thought, though the details are debated. Quirky tidbit, Pliny the Elder, a Roman naturalist, insisted Cleopatra wrote treatises on cosmetics, including recipes for balms and perfumes. Imagine the Queen of Egypt scribbling down instructions like 2 parts beeswax, 3 parts rose oil, while armies prepared for war outside. You can almost picture her as the original beauty vlogger, except instead of YouTube tutorials, her audience was an empire. She moves to a stone mortar, the pestle heavy in her hands, and begins grinding something dark, perhaps pomegranate rind, perhaps dried scorpions. The sound is steady, almost meditative. You're reminded of someone stirring coffee beans in a modern cafe, except here the stakes are considerably higher. The mixture releases a bitter tang, and she pauses, wiping a fleck from her wrist with a cloth embroidered in teal. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's experiments were scientific curiosity or calculated theater. Was she genuinely searching for cures and formulas, or was the apothecary simply another stage to project her aura of mystery and control? Some argue she wanted Rome to believe she held secrets beyond their reach. Others believe she truly loved the craft, that mixing ointments and poisons gave her a private power no court intrigue could take. She gestures for a handmaiden who nervously approaches, holding a wicker basket of figs. Cleopatra plucks one, slices it open with a slender bronze knife, and places a dab of paste inside before closing it again. You know where this image leads. Famous tales of her death say she hid an asp in a basket of figs, the serpent delivering its fatal kiss. Whether true or not, the fruit itself has become part of her legend. Joke one bubbles in your mind. Imagine her trick-or-treating with poisoned figs, definitely the scariest Halloween neighbor. Joke 2, if she had a modern lab, you'd expect her to label jars with emojis, for poison, for perfume. Joke 3. You wonder if her experiments ever went wrong and whether the palace ever had days where everyone sneezed uncontrollably because she spilled too much cinnamon. She turns toward a polished copper mirror, lifting a small clay pot of coal. With practiced fingers, she draws a line along her eyelids, the black powder rich and dark, protecting against both the glare of the sun and the ever-present evil eye. The effect is hypnotic, and you understand how her beauty was enhanced not by raw looks alone, but by chemistry, by the careful design of image. The jars glimmer like stars as servants tidy them away, careful not to spill. You notice small labels scratched in Greek and Egyptian, blending science and art. One jar you imagine holds a balm for burns. Another, perhaps, is a concoction to smooth the skin, and maybe, just maybe, one contains something meant for enemies rather than friends. She dips her fingers in a golden ointment, rubbing it across her hands. The scent is faintly floral, maybe rose blended with almond oil. Her skin catches the lamplight, smooth, glowing, almost unreal. You think about the thousands of years separating you from this moment and realize humans have always chased the same things: longevity, beauty, a little control over an uncontrollable world. Outside, the Nile laps gently against its banks, a reminder that time flows on no matter how many potions you brew. Cleopatra replaces the final jar, wipes her hands, and turns back toward the doorway. The apothecary fades behind her, a secret cave of aromas and dangers, and you sense she enjoys leaving you uncertain. Was it medicine? Was it magic? Was it performance? The truth may be all three, maybe all. As she steps into this corridor, the smoke of incense trailing her like a veil, you feel dizzy from the mingled scents and the weight of all those possibilities. This is no simple queen. This is a woman who can weaponize beauty, bend science into seduction, and leave history forever wondering what was truth and what was myth. The corridors of the palace open into a chamber unlike any you've seen before. Wide, airy, and hung with banners dyed deep indigo and saffron. Pillars gleam with painted hieroglyphs of falcons and cobras, guardians of kings past, and the sound of distant water trickling through hidden pipes keeps the room cool despite the Egyptian sun. At the center, Cleopatra sits not as a queen of ointments or perfumes, but as the sovereign of politics, her throne carved of ebony and inlaid with ivory, a seat designed to remind every visitor of her heritage and her authority. You pause in the shadows, watching as an envoy from Rome is ushered forward. His toga is dusty from travel, his sandals worn, but his eyes are sharp. He bows low, whether out of respect or calculation, it is hard to say. Cleopatra does not rise, she does not need to. Every fold of her teal robe, every tilt of her golden diadem radiates that blend of allure and command for which she is still remembered. Mainstream fact: Cleopatra ruled Egypt as co-regent for nearly 3 decades, first alongside her father, then her brothers, and eventually her son. But unlike many monarchs who were content to be figureheads under Roman shadow, she fought to preserve Egypt's sovereignty through wit, alliances, and audacity. Her famous liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not simply romantic, but political maneuvers meant to secure her throne. Quirky tidbit: ancient sources described Cleopatra as a master of languages, more than half a dozen, including Egyptian, Greek, and possibly Hebrew and Aramaic. While many Ptolemies before her couldn't even speak Egyptian, she could address commoners in their own tongue. Imagine the shock of a fisherman being summoned by the queen and hearing her greet him in flawless native speech, like meeting a celebrity who suddenly chats with you in your hometown slang. The envoy clears his throat, presenting a scroll sealed with wax, perhaps a message from the Senate, perhaps demands disguised as diplomacy. Cleopatra accepts it with one hand, her fingers ringed in lapis and garnet, but she doesn't break the seal immediately. Instead, she speaks in Greek, her voice low, steady, teasing almost. You can't catch every word, but the Roman stiffens, realizing she understands far more than he anticipated. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's intelligence was exaggerated by those who admired her or maligned by those who feared her. Roman propaganda, eager to diminish her, painted her as a seductress whose power came only from her beauty. Yet, papyri and inscriptions reveal a ruler deeply engaged with administration, taxation, and temple building. Was she manipulative temptress, shrewd stateswoman, or both? The debate lingers, unresolved, and perhaps that's exactly how she would have wanted it. She gestures for the envoy to sit on a cushion below her dais. Servants bring trays of figs and pomegranates, wine diluted with cool water, all presented in gilded bowls. The Roman hesitates but accepts. You realize this is another form of negotiation, not merely words but hospitality, a game where each sip or refusal is measured. Joke 1 drifts into your head. Cleopatra would have crushed at modern office politics. Imagine her at a company meeting, sipping coffee while outmaneuvering everyone with a single eyebrow raise. Joke 2, her ability to read languages probably made eavesdropping her secret hobby. No one could gossip safely in her court. Joke 3, you wonder if she ever had to pretend not to understand something just to catch someone revealing too much, like the world's first undercover boss. The Roman unrolls the scroll at her nod, reading aloud a decree demanding tribute. Cleopatra listens, her chin resting lightly on one hand. When he finishes, she smiles. Slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that unsettles rather than comforts. She replies with a parable about the Nile, how the river gives but also takes, and no empire, however vast, can command its flow. The envoy swallows hard. The room feels smaller, hotter, as if the weight of her words thickens the air. She leans forward slightly, gold threads in her robe catching the lamplight, and asks a question, sharp, pointed, impossible to evade. The envoy stammers, tries to circle back, but Cleopatra presses again, her voice still calm. It's less an interrogation than a weaving of nets, each word pulling tighter around him. You watch, half in awe, half in sympathy. To spar verbally with her must feel like trying to wrestle a cobra with bare hands. A servant refills her cup. She takes a slow sip, then finally dismisses the envoy with a wave, as though he has been tested and found wanting. He bows again, sweat visible on his brow, and backs out of the chamber. Only once he is gone does Cleopatra exhale, her shoulders softening for a moment. The performance has ended, but the stakes remain. Every conversation like this could determine the future of Egypt, of her reign, of her survival. She turns her gaze briefly toward the window, where the Nile gleams silver in the afternoon sun. You sense her thoughts stretch far beyond the palace, toward Rome, toward destiny, toward the precarious balance she maintains between two worlds. In her silence, you hear the hum of power, fragile yet fierce, a melody only she can conduct. And then she rises regal once more, prepared for the next visitor, the next plot, the next chance to shape her fate. You realize that in this chamber, Cleopatra is not merely a woman or a queen. She is strategy incarnate, a living argument against the empire that would swallow her whole. The palace feels quieter at night, though the hush is deceptive. Somewhere beyond the thick walls, the Nile glimmers under a silver moon, and the hum of distant insects drifts through carved shutters. You pad down a lantern-lit corridor, following the faintest scent of lotus oil, until the stone opens into a chamber that looks more like a stage than a bedroom. This is Cleopatra's private sanctuary, or as private as a queen's life ever gets. The room glows with pools of lamplight, their flames mirrored in bronze mirrors and polished alabaster jars. Carpets from the east lie beneath your feet, soft, patterned with crimson and indigo, their woven threads telling stories of lions and date palms. At the center, Cleopatra reclines on a couch strewn with cushions, her robe a wash of russet and teal, her eyes rimmed with kohl that deepens the shadow of her thoughts. Beside her, servants move like whispers, refilling cups, adjusting drapes, laying scrolls at her fingertips. Mainstream fact: Cleopatra wasn't only a queen but also a meticulous scholar, someone who spent long nights surrounded by papyri, debating with philosophers and consulting physicians. Alexandria's library, though diminished by her time, still housed knowledge from across the known world, and Cleopatra drew on it eagerly. Her court became a hub of science, medicine, and art. Imagine your local university library, but with incense burning, musicians plucking lutes in the corner, and a queen in gold asking questions sharper than any professor. Quirky tidbit: one source claims Cleopatra experimented with poisons on condemned prisoners to observe effects firsthand. Disturbing, yes, but it reveals her fascination with knowledge at any cost. Some accounts even suggest she tested antidotes and studied snake venom, perhaps foreshadowing the infamous manner of her death. You picture her here, holding a tiny vial up to lamplight, tilting it like a jeweler inspecting a gem, while scribes scratch frantic notes nearby. The chamber is not silent. Outside, a night breeze carries the faint rush of river water, and inside, a harpist plucks soft, meandering chords meant to soothe rather than command. Cleopatra gestures for a tray of figs, but she doesn't eat immediately. She studies them, running her fingers lightly over their skins, as if deciding which one hides the best sweetness. It's not greed, but calculation. She has learned that even in food, there is symbolism. To share a fig with a guest is intimacy. To withhold it is power. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's legendary beauty was the central engine of her charisma, or whether her true magnetism came from this ability to turn any object, any word, any glance into theater. Ancient coins show her with a sharp profile, not the sculpted softness of later statues. Was she physically radiant, or did she create radiance from intellect and presence? The debate continues, but as you watch her in this chamber, the answer feels obvious. Charisma isn't bone structure, it's timing, wit, and confidence. She lifts the scroll, unrolls it, and begins to read aloud. The words are in Greek, a poem perhaps, or a fragment of Homer. Her voice is steady, melodic, wrapping around syllables like silk. You lean closer, lulled by the rhythm. She pauses occasionally to translate, switching into Egyptian so effortlessly you almost forget she is Ptolemaic by blood. The servants nod as if they understand every nuance, though you suspect they are more enchanted by the sound than the meaning. Joke one hums in your mind. Cleopatra probably would have destroyed at karaoke night, switching languages mid-song and still hitting every note. Joke 2, her nightly study sessions must have terrified her enemies. Imagine facing an opponent who's not only gorgeous but also better read than your entire Senate. Joke 3, you wonder if her servants ever pretended to doze just so they wouldn't be quizzed on obscure Greek tragedies. Her attention shifts to a brass basin where oils shimmer under candlelight. She dips her fingers in saffron-scented liquid, smoothing it across her skin, a ritual as practical as it is luxurious. In the dry Egyptian air, oils meant health as much as beauty. She motions to a servant who kneels to rub camellia oil into her hair, combing it with an ivory pick until it gleams like black enamel. Cleopatra closes her eyes, not in vanity, but in discipline, as though every stroke is another thread woven into her armor for the battles of tomorrow. She speaks softly, almost to herself, about Rome, about Caesar, about Antony, about the Senate's ceaseless hunger. Her tone is half weary, half sharp with determination. You realize she rehearses her strategies here, in whispers, the way some people rehearse dreams before sleep. The harpist continues to play, the notes circling her voice like moths around flame. A messenger interrupts, bowing low. He delivers news quickly, perhaps of grain shipments or uprisings near the delta. Cleopatra listens without visible reaction, then gives instructions concise as knife cuts. The messenger departs, and she returns to her couch, plucking at a fig at last, biting into its sweetness with satisfaction. Strategy, poetry, politics, perfume. Her night blends them all until the edges between queen and woman blur. The hour grows late. She waves the harpist away, and silence deepens, broken only by the crackle of oil lamps. She reclines fully now, head tilted back, one hand tracing idle circles on the silk at her side. Perhaps she dreams already of Rome's marble halls or Egypt's endless deserts. Perhaps she dreams of nothing at all, letting exhaustion smother thoughts for once. And you, tucked at the edge of her chamber, sense the paradox that defines her. Both vulnerable and invincible, both scholar and sovereign, both myth and mortal. The lamps sputter, smoke curling upward like faint prayers, and the Queen of Egypt finally drifts towards sleep, though her empire never does. Dawn tastes like cool copper on your tongue as you step from the marble quay onto wood that moves beneath you, alive, elastic, whispering. The Nile slides past in slow green sheets, and the barge that bears you seems less a boat than a traveling temple built to impress the river itself. Ropes hum, pulleys sigh, and somewhere a conch gives a single ceremonial note that hangs over the water like a coin tossed to buy silence. You've heard stories, but stories don't carry the smell. Lotus and cinnamon steeped into canvas, cedar pitch still waking in the heat, a ghost of frankincense drifting from yesterday's lamps. You already know you probably wouldn't survive this level of pageantry before breakfast. Cleopatra thrives on it like sunlight. The deck is a mosaic in wood, cedar planks bordered with darker ebony, brass nails set in tidy constellations. A canopy rises overhead, purple as bruised grapes, its edges weighted with tiny gilded beads that tremble when the breeze teases them. When the light breaks, the beads flash like a scatter of minnows. When a cloud passes, they glow like embers banked for later. Attendants bustle softly, ankles tinkling with bells. The sound turns footsteps into rumor. At the prow, a figurehead carved as Isis stretches her arms, the paint so fine you can read the feathers on each wing. The oarlocks gleam with leafed gold. The oars themselves catch light along their polished shafts, dipping in unison with a hush like silk dragged over stone. Mainstream fact. Plutarch tells us that when Cleopatra sailed to meet Mark Antony at Tarsus, her barge was dressed for myth, sails dyed Tyrian purple, oars said to be silver beating time to flutes, while boys dressed as arrows fanned her on deck, and maidens, masked as sea nymphs, played at being breezes. It was a floating argument, as much theater as transport. The queen as goddess afloat, the river as red carpet, the world invited to gasp. Purple alone said it all, each yard of that dye squeezed from thousands of murex shells, a color you couldn't accidentally afford. You move toward the stern, where a small pavilion rises, its pillars bound with garlands of papyrus and roses. Here, Cleopatra reclines on a low couch, draped in indigo, her bracelets a chain of captured mornings, her hair perfumed so that the wind carries her presence ahead like a herald. She looks not at you first, but at the water, calculating, listening. It's easy to mistake this scene for leisure, yet nothing about it is idle. A river is a road, a barge a billboard, a sail a proclamation. What she sails today will be retold tomorrow in 10 cities, spun again by Rome into flattery or fear. Quirky tidbit floats up with the steam from a copper kettle. Some writers swore the sails themselves were scented, that oil and spice were pressed into the canvas so the wind would blow fragrance into the city before the queen arrived, as if a rumor could be breathed. Others claim the oar blades were polished to mirror brightness, so fish would flock to inspect themselves, turning the river into a cooing audience. You smile at the idea, Cleopatra charming even carp, and you don't entirely disbelieve it. Musicians settle near the mast. Double flutes, a small drum, the lap of a kithara, and the rhythm they choose is not dance, not dirge, but the dignified heartbeat of something inevitable. The helmsman calls time. Oars dip, lift, drip. The drum says yes, yes, yes. The river agrees. A perfume bearer passes with a long-necked bottle. One breath and you're back in her apothecary among jars and questions, except here the mixture is diluted to suggestion, less a cloud than an echo. Even spectacle, you realize, obeys Cleopatra's chemistry. One part beauty, one part rumor, one part purpose. Historians still argue whether the barge of Tarsus was exactly as Plutarch paints it, or if later Roman gossip gilded the memory to turn Cleopatra into theater incarnate. Was there truly a gilded poop deck glittering like a tiny sun? Were the oars really of silver, the sails truly purple end to end, or were these details curated to make Antony look helpless under a spell? The truth, as always, probably lives between exaggeration and understatement. A queen who knew what a fleet could whisper, and a historian who knew what readers wanted to see. You drift closer to the pavilion's shade. Cleopatra's breakfast arrives on a low tray. Cool figs beaded with dew, a round of fresh bread, olives shining like small moons. She breaks a fig, smiles at its amethyst heart, and looks toward shore where crowds gather along the embankment to watch the floating miracle pass. A child points, a fisherman stops mid-cast. Women shade their eyes with palms. Even guards find excuses to turn their heads. Attention is a resource here. She mines it like gold. Joke one swims across your thoughts. If social media existed, this barge would crash every server from Alexandria to Rome. Purple sails, river econ, ISIS IRL. Joke 2, you suspect half the city now claims they smelled her arrive before they saw her, like the world's most elegant weather report. Joke 3, somewhere a practical quartermaster is quietly crying over the laundry bill for perfumed canvas. The breeze strengthens, filling the purple, and the canopy bows like a courtier. You catch the cool river on your skin. A relief after the crisp brightness of deck. Cleopatra calls for a chart. A scribe unrolls papyrus rendered with patient inked bends of the Nile. She traces sandbanks with a lacquered nail, asks about depth here, speed there, villages fond of bread. harbors notorious for petty officials with sticky hands. This is not pageant alone. This is a queen doing river math, the logistics of grain and tax and time. A priest of Isis, white linen whipping, steps forward to murmur a blessing. May the waters bear favor. May the reeds keep their gossip. May crocodiles remember their manners. Cleopatra nods, amused, then gestures to the musicians. The drum softens, the flutes climb, and suddenly the barge feels less like a ship and more like a stage that has learned to move. On shore, the crowd answers with a ripple, hands lifted, scarves waved. Then the city begins to follow along its own banks, walking with the boat as if unwilling to let the scene escape. You lean on the rail and watch light splinter on the water. The silvered oars come up in gleaming crescents, the leafed oarlocks wink, and the wake combs into neat furrows that pull reeds into small bows. A gull laughs, a boy dives, somewhere a baker bangs a peel against a kiln, adding accidental percussion. If Cleopatra's palace at night was a constellation, this is daytime astronomy, everything aligned to describe a single star. She turns to speak with her chamberlain about Antony, about Rome's appetite for heroes and scapegoats, about how one meeting on a riverside can tilt empires. Her tone is conversational, but every sentence wears armor. She knows Tarsus isn't only a place. It's a script, a rumor factory, a mirror she intends to control. Purple sails do what speeches can't. They arrive first, and people keep telling the story you wrote for them. A servant offers wine cooled in a jar lifted moments ago from a woven sleeve of wet rushes, a trick as old as the river. She drinks lightly, sets the cup near a dish of honey cakes, and for a beat the queen looks like anyone pleased by a breeze in a pastry. Then the drum calls time again. The oars obey, the performance resumes. You catch the tiniest residue of pearl and vinegar tale at the back of your mind, the wagered banquet, the swallowed fortune, and you realize the barge is a cousin to that myth, money turned into motion, wealth remade as narrative. By late morning, the air is bright enough to sharpen edges. The canopy beads cast tiny suns across the deck. The musicians pause, rub fingers, sip water. The oarsmen trade places with a fresh crew whose shoulders glisten. The helmsman shifts his stance a finger's width to catch a friendlier current. Logistics again, muscles again. Pageantry isn't free. Cleopatra rises, steps forward, and the onshore murmurs condense into a hush that touches even you. She lifts one hand, not a wave exactly, more a punctuation, and the barge seems to breathe with her. Historians still argue whether this was the moment Antony first surrendered to the idea of Cleopatra. If not the woman, then the world she arranged around herself. Was it perfume and purple and clever casting, or the unmistakable sense that she could make a river behave like a prologue? You cannot answer for a dead general, but standing here with the Nile combed smooth and the air tasting faintly of rose and cedar, you feel how hard it would be to resist the argument. The prow turns toward open water, the city slipping astern like an audience satisfied and reluctant. The purple canopy gives one last shy glitter. On the deck, the figs are fewer, the honey cakes gone, the charts rolled. Cleopatra takes her place beneath the shade, neither victory nor vow on her face, only attention, the kind that weighs, measures, remembers. The barge moves on, a sentence not yet finished, its verb waiting at the next bend. The river keeps sliding beneath your feet, a whispering scroll that unwinds without end, and the barge becomes a stage where the next act insists on beginning. Afternoon sharpens the air into something bright and demanding. You stand in the canopy's shade, listening as servants rearrange trays, musicians pluck lazy notes, and Cleopatra herself leans forward, as if coaxing the horizon closer. She is waiting, though she would never admit to waiting. Ahead lies Tarsus, the city pressed between mountains and river, where Antony, Rome's golden lion turned slightly threadbare, sits like a judge who knows he is also the defendant. Mainstream fact, Cleopatra's famous arrival at Tarsus in 41 BCE was not accidental timing. Antony had summoned her to answer accusations of aiding Cassius, one of Caesar's assassins, but she chose to respond not with excuses on parchment, but with a living myth that would leave Antony gasping. Imagine being called to court and deciding instead to turn the court into your parade. The barge drifts closer to the docks. You can already hear the shifting murmur of the crowd, the tug of sandals over stone, the metallic chatter of Roman soldiers not sure whether to guard or gawk. Overhead, gulls tilt white wings into the sun. The purple canopy glows as though it holds fire within its threads. Cleopatra rises, bracelets ringing like struck glass, and walks toward the rail. The quirky tidbit whispers, some accounts claim she dressed as Aphrodite, Greek goddess of love, lying beneath a canopy while boys, painted as winged Eros, fanned her with plumes and wafted incense across the deck. Others say she simply wore gold-threaded robes and let the river do the boasting. You can't decide which version feels more astonishing, a queen cosplaying as divinity or a queen certain that even without props her presence was already a sermon in flesh. Historians still argue whether Antony staged his reception poorly on purpose or whether Cleopatra's theater outmaneuvered him. Did he fail to arrange a grand welcome, assuming she would arrive timid, only to be dwarfed by her splendor? Or did she deliberately delay her docking, keeping him pacing while the crowd's attention shifted from governor to goddess? Either way, by the time her barge kissed the pier, the verdict was clear. This was not a woman pleading for pardon. This was a sovereign writing the script. The moment stretches, trumpets stammer, Roman soldiers shuffle, and Cleopatra bows her head the barest degree, as though to say, yes, I see you, and yes, I allow you to see me. She descends from the deck in measured steps, purple fabric trailing like a falling dusk, sandals whispering against the gangplank. Around her, attendants scatter rose petals, though the river tries to carry them away. You imagine the air then, the spice of perfumed sails still clinging to the city streets, the sour tang of fish from the docks, the sudden hush as Antony's messengers scurry, unsure whether to escort or be escorted. Cleopatra does not fumble. She glides as if the entire scene had been rehearsed, as though the Nile itself had cued the music. You feel the goosebumps rise, and not from the wind. Joke 1 sidles in. If reality shows had existed, this would be the pilot episode that never got topped. Cleopatra, the entrance. Joke 2, Antony probably wished he had borrowed Octavian's stage manager. Joke 3, the dockside merchants trying to sell onions and amphorae suddenly realized their stall was competing with the actual embodiment of Venus. Bad day for onion sales. The crowd murmurs louder now. Children climb onto barrels for a glimpse. Women pull veils higher, either in modesty or envy. Men shout half-hearted greetings, uncertain whether this arrival is miracle or menace. Antony himself, sunburned, scarred, more soldier than senator, watches from a raised chair. You wonder if his mouth went dry, if his famously booming voice shrank into silence, if in that instant Rome's lion became a kitten lured by purple thread. Mainstream fact continues. Plutarch describes how Cleopatra invited Antony to dine aboard her barge, and when he accepted, he found himself surrounded by luxury so deliberate it felt mythic. Couches of gold, jeweled cups, ceilings draped in embroidered nets, lamps filled with cinnamon oil. Food appeared in such excess that the very leftovers fed hundreds of commoners. She knew generosity doubles as propaganda. You watch the dock blur into torches and laughter as evening settles. Antony finally boards, his armor creaking against the silks, his Roman bluntness softened by wine pressed into his hand before he can object. Cleopatra reclines, half-lidded, as if this feast is a casual picnic rather than the opening move in a game for survival. You taste spiced lamb, figs, honey dripping across platters, and the faint burn of imported pepper as strong as Rome's coin. Quirky detail for dessert, later writers claimed Cleopatra once bet Antony that she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal, then dissolved one of her immense pearl earrings in vinegar, drinking it as if sipping broth. Historians doubt the chemistry, but the story clung, because even if the pearl never fizzed, the audacity sparkled. Tonight's barge banquet feels like rehearsal for that legend, every grape another coin tossed into memory. Historians still argue whether Antony fell for Cleopatra the woman, Cleopatra the queen, or Cleopatra the performance. Was it seduction or strategy? Was he enchanted or merely calculating the grain shipments Egypt could provide for his next campaign? The debate ripples on, but here on the barge, watching torches gild the canopy and hearing the water slap rhythm against the hull, you feel certain that logic had little to do with it. The banquet swells, laughter thickens the air, music spins faster, and Antony leans close, his scarred hand resting near Cleopatra's as though Rome itself might tip if he reached another inch. You almost pity him, you almost envy him. The barge rocks gently, but it is the world that shifts. Joke 3 sidles at the close. Someone somewhere on shore is probably still waiting for Cleopatra to show up at the governor's office, parchment in hand, wondering if she got lost. You know better. She wasn't lost. She was rewriting the map. The river exhales, the torches flare, and the myth moves on, wrapped in laughter and wine, carrying Antony like a passenger who never noticed he'd already boarded. The torches burn lower now, ash drifting like lazy fireflies into the night, and you feel the shift from performance to aftermath. Antony, softened by wine and perhaps more by wonder, lingers on the barge until the stars tilt overhead. Cleopatra reclines as though the entire spectacle were routine, her smile steady, her bracelets chiming whenever she lifts a hand. She has played her part, and the ripples are still moving outward through Tarsus like waves on the river. Mainstream fact: Antony and Cleopatra soon struck an agreement that would reshape the Eastern Mediterranean. He promised military protection and political favor, while she pledged Egypt's immense wealth and grain supplies. These were not small promises. They were lifelines for Rome's armies and shields for Cleopatra's throne. Yet here, amid the smoldering lamps, it doesn't feel like negotiation. It feels like flirtation disguised as strategy, or maybe strategy disguised as flirtation. You imagine Antony staring too long, as though memorizing the line of Cleopatra's jaw, the deliberate tilt of her head, the way she seemed to listen without bowing. He was a soldier, a man used to thunder and dust, suddenly confronted with silk and incense. No wonder he lingered, fumbling his cup, waiting for cues that Cleopatra had already rehearsed. Quirky tidbit drifts in. Roman gossip later claimed Cleopatra enchanted Antony with witchcraft, her perfumes mixed with hidden potions, her gaze lined with magic powders. Some even swore she kept scrolls of secret spells locked in the palace. It's probably nonsense, but you smile imagining Cleopatra stirring a cauldron and muttering, "Step 1, convince Rome with eyeliner." Magic, after all, comes in many disguises. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's allure was physical beauty, charisma, or calculated theater. Ancient coins show her features as sharp, almost severe, not the Hollywood siren you picture. Maybe her magnetism was never in the cheekbones, but in the command, the way she could enter a room or river city and rearrange the air itself. Beauty fades, presence rewrites memory. As the barge rocks gently, Antony laughs, his voice booming enough to wake gulls roosting nearby. Cleopatra doesn't flinch. She laughs too, but softer, letting him echo himself into the night. You sip the spiced wine in your imagination, feel it warm your chest, and think of how this alliance, born on perfume and purple sails, would soon spiral into something history would never forget. The banquet shifts into stories. Soldiers brag about battles, Egyptian attendants tell tales of the Nile flooding, crocodiles swallowing goats whole. Cleopatra interjects with a sly anecdote about Julius Caesar, never too sharp, never too soft. You catch Antony's eyebrow twitch at the mention, but Cleopatra smooths the moment with a smile, turning memory into thread and weaving Antony back into her tapestry. Joke 1 tumbles in. Cleopatra probably invented the ancient version of the soft launch. First show Antony the luxury barge, then hint gently that Caesar was impressed too. Subtle flex. Joke 2. Antony's aides must have been whispering, "Sir, you summoned her for an interrogation, not a date." Joke 3. The sailors rowing the barge are probably rolling their eyes. Another night, another love-struck Roman general. When dawn begins to pale the horizon, Antony finally departs, but not without an invitation. He promises to dine with Cleopatra the following evening, this time in his own quarters. Yet when he arrives, the food is plain, the lamps ordinary, the entertainment modest. He looks almost embarrassed. Cleopatra smiles politely, but never says aloud what everyone feels. The governor of Tarsus cannot compete with the Queen of Egypt's stagecraft. Mainstream fact continues. Antony eventually left Tarsus to campaign in Syria, but when winter approached, he followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria, choosing her company over political duties in Rome. It was a scandalous decision, one that Octavian would later weaponize. But here, in the quiet dawn after Tarsus, it feels less like scandal and more like inevitability. Quirky tidbit sparkles. Some sources suggest Cleopatra once wagered with Antony about fishing, accusing him of cheating when he had servants secretly attach fish to his hook underwater. Instead of scolding, she laughed and staged her own prank, having divers attach salted fish so Antony reeled up something already pickled. Humor, it seems, was part of her arsenal, sharper than swords. Historians still argue whether Antony was truly ensnared by passion or simply entrapped by necessity. Egypt's wealth was irresistible. Cleopatra's wit was undeniable. Was he in love or in debt to both? Maybe the two were the same currency, impossible to separate like silver melted into gold. The river city fades behind you. Cleopatra stands at the prow again, morning light gilding her profile, and you sense the stage lights dimming only because the act is complete. Antony has been moved, the bargain sealed, the empire nudged a degree off its axis. You feel the hush, the pause before the next song. Joke 3 lingers like smoke. If Cleopatra had lived today, she'd have invented the concept of the power couple and probably trademarked it. Antony just didn't know he'd signed the contract on a barge. The sails snap once more, the current pulls south, and history slides forward. An alliance of hearts, crowns, and appetites, born on a river that still remembers the echo of drums and perfume on the wind. Morning folds over Alexandria like a silk shawl, soft and bright at once, and you follow Cleopatra inland from the harbor toward a district that hums with quieter power than purple sails or jeweled banquets. The streets here smell less of fish and cinnamon and more of papyrus dust, lamp oil, and the faint metallic tang of bronze hinges that have turned 1,000 times. You pass porticos where students argue in Greek about constellations and courtyards where scribes tap reed pens against the rims of ink pots like impatient crickets. Ahead, the library's precinct rises, a hive of colonnades, gardens, lecture rooms, and storerooms, a city within a city where knowledge is the currency and curiosity the only tax collector who never sleeps. Cleopatra moves through the gate as if returning to a favorite room of her childhood, which, in a sense, she is. The Ptolemies built this engine of learning. She is its heir as much as she is heir to crowns. Her steps slow in the cool shadow of the colonnade, where a pool reflects a rectangle of sky, and 2 ibis birds pick their way along the marble coping like critics judging reflections. You taste the air, chalk from tablets, ashes from last night's lamps, the faint sweetness of gum arabic that binds pigments to manuscripts. Mainstream fact: the Library of Alexandria, paired with the Museum, was the greatest intellectual complex of antiquity, famed for collecting, copying, and commenting on texts from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Ships docking in Alexandria could have their scrolls temporarily seized, copied by professional scribes, and returned, while the originals joined the library's hoard. It wasn't only a vault. It was a factory for ideas, a place where catalogs, lexicons, astronomical tables, and medical treatises multiplied like spring swallows. Even after earlier fires and political upheavals, portions of this scholarly machine endured into Cleopatra's time, shrunk perhaps, but still breathing knowledge in and out. And you step into a reading hall where light skims in from high windows, throwing gentle lattices across long tables. Scribes crouch over fresh copies, their shoulders moving in patient tides. Librarians pad between shelves with tally boards and wax tablets, mouths full of notes they don't dare swallow. A scholar with hair like a startled dandelion recites a passage from Euripides to no one in particular. A mathematician scolds a student for drawing triangles like exhausted cookies. Cleopatra pauses, smiles without showing teeth, and the room calibrates itself to her presence without losing its rhythm. This is not court, no one bows. They nod, they murmur, Basileia, and continue writing. Because a line half finished is an itch scholars cannot bear. Quirky tidbit wafts up with the dust. The library kept not just books but oddities, astronomical globes, dissected animal specimens, strange plants in jars, and, according to some gossips, a mechanical automaton or two that creaked obligingly during lectures. One inventor supposedly built a tiny brass pigeon that could flap for a few heartbeats, another a siphon that made wine appear to flow uphill during demonstrations. You picture Cleopatra watching these party tricks with a queen's poker face and a child's delight, filing away which contraption might amuse a visiting dignitary or terrify a superstitious general. A librarian brings a tray of scrolls, one sealed with a tag that reads, "On the Mendesian perfume," another, "The Constellations of Hipparchus," and a third, simply Herodotus. Cleopatra chooses the middle one first, unrolling neat columns of Greek that pinprick the night sky onto papyrus. Her finger traces the path of Sirius. She murmurs about heliacal risings, the proper omens for planting, the calendar's stubborn misbehavior whenever politicians try to bully it. You realize her attention isn't abstract. Stars tell farmers when to sow. Harvest tells treasuries when to breathe. She is not stargazing. She is account-keeping in the language of heaven. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra had direct authority over library policy or simply patronized its scholars like a discerning conductor. Some late sources credit her with sponsoring translations and commentaries. Others insist the institution, diminished though it was, carried its own momentum. The truth likely sits between a queen who used scholars as instruments and scholars who used a queen as weather, steadying when clear, bracing when storms gathered. A mathematician bows at a cautious angle and offers a tablet scratched with a problem about the volume of a truncated cone, necessary, he claims, for computing grain in tapered jars. Cleopatra laughs softly, not at him, but at the elegance of math-solving kitchen worries. She multiplies with a stylus, checks his constants, and suggests a simpler approximation for hurried stewards. The mathematician blinks, then grins like someone given a new toy. Joke 1 rustles through your head. If Cleopatra attended your modern staff meetings, she'd fix the spreadsheet cell references before anyone finished saying action items. Joke 2, she'd also reformat the document, add footnotes, and teach the office coffee machine to dispense rosewater. Joke 3, you suspect she'd win Best Librarian Whisperer at annual awards and still make the after-party smell like frankincense. She shifts to Herodotus, skimming one of his wilder anecdotes about Egypt's marvels, and snorts in a way you didn't know queens were allowed to snort. Charming, she says in Greek, but he loved a story more than a fact. Then she asks for an Egyptian chronicle, something drier and closer to temple records. A priest in linen appears from the shadow, like punctuation, recites a passage on offerings and tax relief during poor Niles, and Cleopatra files it straight into her mind's ledger. The hall's side door yawns to a courtyard, where a bronze armillary casts rings of shadow on pebbles. Cleopatra steps out, touches the cool metal, and asks an astronomer to demonstrate a lunar eclipse with string and shadow. He obliges. The moon's mimic slides into tidy darkness on the courtyard floor. Children of a librarian, allowed to haunt the fringes if they remain quiet as dust, gawk until one whispers, "Can she stop an eclipse?" The mother shushes, but Cleopatra hears and smiles. "No one stops the sky," she says, "but we can promise lamps and a story so no one is afraid." You tuck the line away, the way one tucks a charm into a sleeve. Policy as comfort, rule as reassurance. Inside again, a perfume specialist unwraps a small glass vial, the Mendesian blend. The room, already saturated with papyrus and oil, receives a new note, honeyed, resinous, with a shadow of bitter myrrh. Cleopatra inhales, eyes narrowing in thought. The recipe, the specialist explains, depends on aging. Without time, it shouts. With time, it sings. The queen nods, then surprises him. She suggests a fraction more cinnamon for winter batches when the air is damp and the body cold. He writes it down like a minor law. Here, knowledge holds hands with luxury, and both obey her practical ear. Mainstream fact circles back. In Alexandria, scholarship fed government. The library's catalogers, like Callimachus generations earlier, organized texts so administrators could fetch laws and precedents. Doctors trained with herbal manuals, navigators copied star lists, poets earned stipends to polish the city's pride. Cleopatra, raised in these corridors, speaks the dialect of usefulness. She's not simply collecting wisdom like jewelry. She's fitting it like tools into a chest that must open quickly when storms hit. A scribe timidly asks if she will donate a copy of a new decree to the archives, as earlier Ptolemies did. She dictates smoothly: grain allotments to coastal villages damaged by storms, tax delays, temple maintenance funded from festival surpluses, penalties for merchants who water wine beyond mercy. The scribe scratches, sand dries ink, the decree receives a clay seal. In this moment, the library is not museum but engine, coupling words to wagons of wheat. Historians still argue whether the Grand Library buildings survived in Cleopatra's exact era, or if activity had shifted into daughter libraries and private collections around the quarter. Fires, neglect, politics, all nibbled at the edges. Yet the scholarly habit persisted, changing rooms when rooms changed rulers. You stand amid shelves that are both fragile and stubborn, and you understand knowledge rarely dies, it molts. Afternoon leans warm against the windows. A philosopher begins a lecture about whether fortune favors the virtuous or merely the lucky. Cleopatra listens for a while, then interrupts with a question sharp as a papyrus edge. If fortune is a wind which sails, do we cut larger, virtue or skill? The room murmurs, the philosopher blinks, the debate resets with better wind. She smiles, she has steered a conversation like a ship into a more useful current. Before she leaves, she writes 2 lines with her own hand on a scrap. A brief offering for Sechat, goddess of writing. May the tallies be true, the copies exact, the minds awake. She tucks it into a niche behind a pillar where other slips rest like pressed flowers, vows made by people who worship accuracy. You feel the hum of it, that quiet faith which rebuilds civilizations after louder faiths burn them. On the steps outside, the city blazes white in mid-afternoon. The students argue again. A vendor sells figs to the hungry rationalists. A boy chases his shadow across the paving stones and wins. Cleopatra pauses under a palm's thin shade and looks back once, as if counting the shelves with her eyes. Then she turns toward the palace, toward grain accounts, troop lists, a dinner she will make into memory. The library exhales, lamps snuff for a nap, and you follow a queen who treats wisdom as both ornament and armor. Evening drapes its long violet shawl over Alexandria, and you trail Cleopatra into a quieter wing of the palace, where voices hush and laughter tiptoes. This is the nursery quarter, though nursery feels too small a word for chambers that blend soft mats with gilded cradles, tutors' desks, and walls painted with scenes of Nile birds. The air is sweeter here, not with incense or perfume, but with honey cakes and the warm milk of goats kept nearby for the littlest mouths. You hear a rustle of linen, the hiccup of a child's laugh, the thump of a wooden toy falling, and in the midst of it all, Cleopatra's voice lowers into something softer than silk, a sound few outside these rooms ever know. Her children are here, little Alexander Helios, radiant in name if not yet in wisdom, Cleopatra Selene, a girl with eyes that already calculate stars, and the younger twins who still measure time by naps and cries. Tonight the room glows with lamplight that turns gold leaf into warm halos. Cleopatra kneels, adjusting a miniature chiton, smoothing tangled curls, listening as a tutor recites Greek fables with dramatic hand flourishes. The children giggle when the fox tricks the crow, and Cleopatra giggles too, though hers comes with a knowing edge. She has dealt with foxes in her court more cunning than any storybook could imagine. Mainstream fact: Cleopatra bore 4 children known to history, 3 by Mark Antony and 1 Caesarion by Julius Caesar. Their fates wove into the tragic tapestry of Rome's civil wars, but in these years inside Alexandria they were symbols of dynastic hope. Caesarion, named Little Caesar, represented her attempt to anchor legitimacy through bloodline. Later, Antony's children embodied alliances with Rome and Egypt alike. Scholars still argue how much these offspring lived like royal heirs, or like pawns waiting to be moved on a board where dice clattered far away in Roman hands. A servant brings a carved box filled with wax tablets. Cleopatra beckons the eldest boy closer, guides his stylus hand over Greek letters, then Egyptian hieroglyphs. She insists they learn both tongues fluently. One is the language of empire, the other of roots. You watch the boy's brow crease with concentration, his mother's hand steadying the curve of an aleph, and you realize this queen is weaving rope for her children, twisting strands of culture so tightly they might hold against the storm. Quirky tidbit sneaks in. One tale insists Cleopatra had tiny thrones made for her twins so they could attend minor court rituals, perched like solemn dolls beside her, the courtiers pretending not to coo. Whether the story is embroidered gossip or genuine pageant detail, you picture the toddlers fidgeting on gilded seats, dropping a toy, and watching the entire room freeze in horror until the queen herself chuckled. That image lingers, power softened by play. She sings to them now, not in Greek or courtly Egyptian, but in a lullaby borrowed from villagers along the Nile, about a crocodile that carries the moon on its back. Her voice threads through the chamber. The tutor falls silent. Even the goat bleats softly in rhythm. Joke one tickles you. If Spotify existed, Cleopatra would top the charts under ancient lullaby hits. Joke 2, her playlist would alternate between soothing nursery tunes and absolute bangers like Ode to Grain Tax and 7. Joke 3, you imagine a Roman senator forced to babysit here, dozing off mid-song, drool soaking his toga. The children's eyes droop, but curiosity fights sleep. Cleopatra Selene asks why the moon changes shape, and her mother, instead of brushing it aside, explains with a fingertip drawing circles on a pillow: sunlight, earth, shadow. The girl nods, filing it away like a jewel. Later, she will rule Mauritania and carry her mother's intellect westward, for now she tucks the knowledge beside her doll. Both treasures. A tutor coughs politely, reminding the queen of schedules, but Cleopatra waves him off. Rules bend around her children. She insists on one more story. This time she chooses a tale of Isis searching for Osiris, her voice a lantern glowing steady. You hear layers, myth as comfort, myth as legacy, myth as political signal. Her children, half Roman in lineage, must still hear Egyptian roots lull them to sleep. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra truly mothered daily in these ways, or if much of the child rearing fell to tutors, wet nurses, and servants. Royal protocol often distanced rulers from domestic intimacy, yet scattered notes and the tenderness preserved in anecdotes suggest she carved time for the softness. Maybe not every night, maybe not without interruption, but enough that memory clung like perfume. One child yawns hugely, another curls on her lap, and Cleopatra shifts so her robe becomes their blanket. You notice her crown is absent here. No diadem, no serpent crest. Instead, she wears a plain indigo gown, sleeves rolled loosely, as if to remind herself that royalty doesn't tuck in a sleepy toddler. Mothers do. The lamplight paints her profile not as marble, not as coin, but as warmth. A servant enters with barley water in tiny cups. Cleopatra sips, then coaxes the eldest to drink. She jokes that if they can recite Homer by next year, she'll allow an extra fig at supper. The boy smirks, already plotting to memorize just enough lines to win sweets. A deal between mother and child, more binding than any treaty. The room settles. Outside, cicadas hum a bass line. Inside, Cleopatra leans back, stroking Selene's hair, whispering promises that tomorrow will bring another story, another lesson, another hug. You see the weight of empire slide from her shoulders for this hour, leaving only the softer burden of love. And you feel a pang. These moments, too fragile, will one day shatter under Rome's march. For now, though, they are whole, and you drift with them into drowsy peace. The palace empties into night, and for once the corridors are quiet enough that your sandals echo. You follow Cleopatra through an archway where guards step back, bowing low, and enter the grand audience chamber. Here she becomes the queen again, the mother's lullabies tucked away, her face sharpened into command. Lamps hang high, flickering light across columns painted in lapis and cinnabar, their shadows stretching long like watchful giants. At the far end rises the throne, not overly massive, but raised enough to remind everyone who holds gravity here. Courtiers gather, some whispering, some wide-eyed, a few smirking behind fans. Ambassadors from smaller kingdoms kneel, presenting bolts of cloth, jars of honey, and carved ivory. Cleopatra listens, nods, gestures with a hand ringed in gold. You watch how she balances severity with charm, slipping a smile here, a furrowed brow there, each move deliberate. It's less ruling than acting, though the stakes are higher than any stage. Mainstream fact, Cleopatra wasn't simply a decorative monarch under Rome's thumb. She exercised real political power, negotiating with foreign envoys, commanding fleets, and overseeing Egypt's treasury. Coins minted with her face and name prove her authority, unusual for queens of the era. Historians still argue whether her autonomy was absolute or always tethered by alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. What you see tonight suggests a woman who knew exactly how much rope she had and pulled every inch of it. She invites an envoy from Nubia closer, accepts a bundle of ostrich feathers, and in return promises Egyptian grain shipments when the floods are kind. Another kneels with lapis lazuli beads, hoping for protection in trade disputes. Cleopatra's voice flows in Greek, then in Egyptian, shifting tongues effortlessly. The courtiers murmur admiration, not just at the fluency, but at how her words glide like oil, smoothing over jagged politics. Quirky tidbit surfaces. Some chroniclers claimed Cleopatra once disguised herself in common linen to sneak into her own court, listening to what officials whispered when they thought she wasn't there. If true, you wonder if tonight she recalls any of those secret observations while smiling politely at men who had perhaps once mocked her in shadow. Joke 1. Imagine their faces if they realized the serving girl they gossiped to last week is now perched on the throne. Joke 2, maybe she even left them bad Yelp reviews and hieroglyphs. Joke 3, you half expect her to wink at you, conspiratorial, as if the two of you are in on the joke. The chamber swells with petitioners, farmers pleading relief from taxes after poor harvests, merchants begging for lighter tariffs, priests reminding her of temple needs. Cleopatra weighs each, scribes bending over papyrus to record decisions. She grants leniency here, refuses there, balancing mercy and austerity like a juggler who cannot drop a single ball. Her tone never rises, but it slices through excuses like a blade. One farmer stammers, claiming his oxen died mysteriously, leaving fields untilled. Cleopatra leans forward, eyes narrowing, and suggests he borrow beasts from the temple herd until his family recovers. Practical, yet reminding him that nothing is free in her Egypt. You watch the farmer bow so low his forehead nearly grazes stone, both relieved and wary. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra ruled with genuine empathy for her people or whether her generosity was mostly performance meant to secure loyalty. Some records highlight famine relief and debt forgiveness. Others accuse her of lavish spending on luxuries while peasants suffered. Truth likely coils somewhere between, as it often does in politics. At one point, she requests silence, lifts a papyrus scroll, and reads aloud. Tax decrees written in both hieroglyphs and Greek. Her voice is steady, melodic, even in bureaucracy. The courtiers pretend to understand every clause, though you suspect half are just admiring how regally she rolls her R's. A guard yawns discreetly, and you bite back laughter. As the night deepens, Cleopatra rises from her throne, gestures for musicians to play softly on flutes and harps. The mood shifts from rigid governance to something closer to ritual. Ambassadors sip wine, nobles chatter, and the queen drifts among them, weaving threads of diplomacy as deftly as her scribes weave ink. You notice she never lingers too long with any one guest, just enough to leave them flattered, just short of leaving them presumptuous. Quirky detail again. She wears a faint perfume tonight, likely kaifi, a blend of honey, wine, raisins, myrrh, and herbs. Ancient texts say it soothed nerves and even induced sleep if burned at night. You inhale and nearly swoon, thinking joke 1. If Febreze bottled this, they'd call it Royal Seduction number 29. Joke 2, one spritz and suddenly your grocery list feels like epic poetry. Joke 3, you wonder if Caesar ever complained about smelling like raisins after long dinners together. Finally, she signals an end. The courtiers bow, the ambassadors retreat, and Cleopatra walks back toward her private chambers, every inch of her posture still regal, yet you catch the tiniest exhale, the kind only noticed in quiet. Rule is performance, and performances tire even the best actors. She passes you, her robe brushing marble, and you glimpse faint smudges on her hands from ink and papyrus, evidence of the real work beneath the spectacle. Power, you realize, isn't just diadems and speeches, it's also cramped fingers, long nights, and choices that ripple far beyond these gilded halls. As the lamps dim, you follow her out, the throne room receding behind like a stage after the curtain falls, its echoes lingering. You can almost hear tomorrow already, another round of petitions, politics, and whispered intrigue waiting in the wings. The night air is cooler now, brushing against your skin as you trail behind Cleopatra down a shaded colonnade. Torches gutter in their iron sconces, the flame light licking over carved reliefs of lotus flowers and falcons. She walks slowly, her sandals whispering, no longer performing for courtiers, but carrying the weight of decisions made. You expect her to retreat to her private chambers, yet instead she veers toward a smaller doorway where laughter and faint music leak out like sparks. Inside is not a throne room or study, but a salon, a chamber filled with cushions, low tables, and the faint scent of date wine. Here Cleopatra entertains differently. Instead of priests and generals, philosophers and poets recline, their robes draped loosely, scrolls unrolled across knees. A lute plucks somewhere in the corner, and you realize this is her playground where wit is tested as much as policy. Mainstream fact. Cleopatra prided herself on being more than just a figurehead. She was a patron of learning, inheriting the intellectual tradition of the Library of Alexandria. Records suggest she could debate science, philosophy, and medicine, engaging with scholars on equal footing. Historians still argue whether her knowledge was deeply technical or more performative, a queen who studied enough to impress but leaned on advisors for the hard detail. Tonight, it feels real enough. She settles onto a saffron cushion, wine cup in hand, and listens as a Greek poet recites verses about moonlight on the Nile. His voice is lilting, his hair oiled, his gestures a little too dramatic. Cleopatra smiles politely, then interrupts with her own couplet in Egyptian, weaving humor and metaphor. The room bursts into laughter, the poet bowing exaggeratedly in mock defeat. Joke 1: if slam poetry existed back then, Cleopatra would have been a reigning champion. A mathematician rises next, scratching shapes in charcoal on a wooden tablet, trying to demonstrate a principle of geometry. Cleopatra interrupts again, asking slyly how his theory could help her count the jars of grain rotting in some warehouse upriver. The salon chuckles. It's a test. Brilliance measured not in abstraction but in utility. You see the mathematician blush, scramble for an answer, and finally mutter something about measuring volume by displacement. Cleopatra nods, satisfied. Joke 2: you almost expect her to hand him a mop and say, "Excellent, you're on cleanup duty." Quirky tidbit: some accounts claim Cleopatra studied alchemy, experimenting with strange mixtures and tinctures in search of both medicine and perhaps a whiff of immortality. Whether true or fanciful, the image fits. The queen here, swirling wine, discussing stars and human frailty, her mind never far from the mysteries beyond papyrus margins. The conversation drifts. A Roman visitor nervously praises Egypt's monuments, hoping to flatter. Cleopatra steers the talk toward politics disguised as philosophy, dropping questions about justice, loyalty, and the burden of empire. The salon grows thoughtful, voices low, the playful air shifting towards something sharper. You sense that these salons aren't just diversion, they are her laboratory, testing arguments, gauging minds, rehearsing the speeches that later might steer empires. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were truly intimate or carefully staged performances. Some say Cleopatra used them to cultivate loyalty among Egypt's intellectual elite, ensuring her image spread as a wise ruler. Others believe they were personal retreats, her only chance to breathe and laugh freely without political calculation. Perhaps, like much else in her life, the truth threads between. You notice servants weaving quietly among cushions, refilling cups with pomegranate wine, setting down trays of figs and cheese. Cleopatra eats sparingly, though her eyes linger on the fruit, as if weighing whether indulgence or restraint better suits a philosopher queen tonight. She plucks a fig at last, biting slowly, the juice catching the lamplight. Joke 3: you think even Socrates might have agreed wisdom is easier with snacks. At one point, a musician begins a gentle tune, the lute strings resonant, almost mournful. Cleopatra leans back, her eyes half closed, and for a fleeting moment you glimpse not a ruler, not a debater, but a woman, tired, contemplative, perhaps even lonely amid the chatter she herself orchestrates. The salon continues buzzing, but she drifts slightly apart, the fig stem discarded like a broken thought. You wonder what weighs on her, Rome's looming shadow, Egypt's fragile harvest, or simply the endless performance of intellect demanded nightly. Yet as quickly as the veil lowers, she straightens, makes a joke about philosophers loving their arguments more than their wives, and the laughter resumes. The gathering stretches deep into the night. Lamps dim, voices soften, and Cleopatra finally signals an end. Scrolls are rolled, cups drained, sandals scuff the marble as the thinkers file out, still debating under their breath. She remains seated a moment longer, staring at the last curl of smoke rising from the oil lamp. When she rises, it's with a grace that feels rehearsed yet weary. She passes you on her way out, and you catch the faintest trace of pomegranate on her lips, mingled with wine. She has conquered another arena tonight, though the victory looks quieter, subtler, less gilded than the throne room. Still, in its way, no less powerful. As you follow her down the hall, the murmur of scholars fading behind you, the palace feels like a vast stage with endless acts. Politics by day, philosophy by night, Cleopatra plays them all, never breaking character, though you suspect each performance leaves shadows you may glimpse only in passing. The palace corridors echo softly as you walk, shadows stretching long beneath torchlight. Cleopatra does not head for her chambers, but instead to a balcony that overlooks the Nile, its surface glimmering under a rising moon. The river whispers below, carrying both fish and secrets. She leans against the carved stone balustrade, her linen robe catching a faint breeze, the indigo fabric embroidered with silver stars that almost blend into the night sky. You stand slightly behind, aware you're intruding on a private ritual, her communion not with people, but with the water that birthed her kingdom. Mainstream fact: Cleopatra sailed the Nile often in ceremonial processions, presenting herself as Isis reborn, the goddess wife of Osiris, bringing fertility to Egypt. The river was not just geography, it was lifeblood, agriculture, trade, and myth, all braided into one. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra truly believed herself a divine incarnation or used the imagery purely as political theater. Out here in the silver glow, you suspect it may have been both. She closes her eyes and whispers something in Egyptian, soft, rhythmic, a prayer, or perhaps a poem. The sound mixes with the lapping of water, blending devotion with longing. You imagine priests at temples reciting similar verses to gods carved in stone, but here the goddess herself seems to bow before the living Nile. A quirky tidbit floats into memory. Some chronicles claim Cleopatra had small boats fitted with golden oars and scented sails, so that when she sailed at dusk, fishermen swore they could smell her approach before they saw her. The notion makes you smile. Only Cleopatra could turn an evening row into an olfactory miracle. Joke 1. You think she might have been history's first walking air freshener. She straightens, watching faint ripples where moonlight drapes silver across the current. Her gaze is unreadable, half strategy, half meditation. The river is both mirror and map. It reflects her face while charting the routes of armies, grain ships, and Roman envoys who drift into her harbors. You imagine her calculating silently, weighing what tribute, what alliance, what gamble tomorrow may demand. Suddenly, a splash breaks the quiet. A fish leaps, shatters the moon's reflection, and vanishes again. Cleopatra laughs, low and warm, the first unguarded sound you've heard in hours. She murmurs that the Nile itself mocks her seriousness. Joke 2, you wonder if the fish just became the bravest critic in Egypt. She turns, resting her arms on the balcony, speaking almost as if to herself. The river remembers more than men do. The words hang, heavy and mysterious. You realize she might be thinking of past pharaohs, their monuments crumbling, while the Nile flows indifferent. Power, however dazzling, is always a ripple on its endless surface. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra truly saw herself as the last of Egypt's line or whether she believed Rome's embrace could preserve her dynasty. Looking at her tonight, framed by riverlight, you sense both hope and resignation. She is not blind to decline, yet she refuses to surrender her image as sovereign of eternity. A servant approaches quietly with a silver jug of wine. Cleopatra waves him away, choosing instead to sip from a simple clay cup. The choice surprises you, deliberate humility in a woman surrounded by gold. Joke 3 flickers. Perhaps she knows that wine tastes better from clay, or perhaps she simply wants to prove she isn't addicted to bling. The river breeze carries hints of lotus and mud, mingling sweet and earthy. You breathe deeply, feeling the Nile's strange perfume settle into your chest. Cleopatra does the same, her shoulders softening. For a heartbeat, she is just another woman savoring night air, not the world's most scrutinized queen. Yet even here, performance intrudes. She adjusts her robe, lifts her chin, and points subtly toward the horizon where faint torches flicker on a passing barge. Roman traders, she murmurs, tone neutral but sharp. Every shadow on the river becomes intelligence. Every sail hints at shifting power. She watches until the lights fade, then finally exhales. The moon climbs higher, silver spilling over pylons and obelisks in the distance. Cleopatra whispers again, but this time the words are almost playful. Perhaps the gods are bored of temples and prefer the river. You smile, imagining deities lounging on lily pads. The moment lingers, half joke, half truth, and the night seems to nod in agreement. Eventually she steps back, her eyes still on the water, before turning toward the palace. Her bare feet glide over the cool stone, her shadow stretching long behind. The Nile murmurs on, endless, indifferent, eternal. You realize Cleopatra has staged countless processions and audiences, yet this, standing alone with the river, may be her truest performance, one where only the water is audience, and its applause comes in ripples and reflections. You follow Cleopatra back inside, but instead of retreating to silence, she enters a chamber alive with sound. The banquet hall breathes with torchlight, shadows shimmering across carved pillars and painted ceilings. Bronze braziers glow, spilling warmth into the night air. Servants glide between tables with trays of roasted meats, bowls of figs, honey-drizzled pastries, and amphorae of dark red wine. Musicians strum lutes and tap small drums, weaving a rhythm that dances in the background like a heartbeat. Mainstream fact, Cleopatra was famed for her lavish banquets, often using them as political theater to impress envoys, generals, and even rivals. Ancient sources describe tables piled high with delicacies, sometimes so extravagant that Roman writers accused her of wasteful excess. Historians still argue whether these reports were exaggerations born of Roman propaganda or faithful accounts of her culinary diplomacy. Tonight, the hall is undeniably spectacular, and whether myth or truth, you feel her strategy in every polished cup and candle flame. She takes her place at a low, gilded couch, reclining with practiced grace. Around her, guests, officials, priests, favored attendants bow slightly before finding their own seats. You settle nearby, your senses overwhelmed by roasted lamb scented with cumin, dates stuffed with almonds, and fresh pomegranates bursting like jeweled grenades. The air is thick with cinnamon and laughter. A quirky tidbit floats into your memory. One tale insists Cleopatra once dissolved a pearl in vinegar and drank it simply to win a wager that she could host the most expensive banquet in history. The science of whether a pearl could fully dissolve in vinegar is debated, but the image sticks. Cleopatra casually sipping the ocean's jewelry as if it were lemonade. Joke 1, you picture her choking halfway and calling for a spoon. The queen gestures and musicians swell louder. Dancers enter, their saffron and teal garments swirling as anklets chime. Cleopatra claps softly to the rhythm, her fingers adorned with rings that catch the firelight. She does not need to speak. Her smile alone directs the room's energy. You realize that here, in this hall, she rules not with armies, but with atmosphere. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's banquets were truly occasions of indulgence for her court or carefully calculated tools of statecraft to keep allies close and enemies disarmed. Watching her tonight, you suspect both. She lifts her goblet, offering it to a Roman envoy seated across the table, and with that simple gesture, centuries of tension dissolve for the span of a toast. You sip your own wine, spiced, heady, almost too rich, and nearly cough. Cleopatra notices, hiding a smirk behind her hand. Joke 2, perhaps she enjoys watching her guests wobble under the influence, making diplomacy a little easier to negotiate. The meal continues. Platters of grilled fish arrive, their skins crisped and brushed with sesame oil. Honey cakes follow, stacked like tiny golden bricks. Cleopatra nibbles sparingly, more host than participant, but every bite she takes is deliberate, a performance in itself. The conversations swirl, Greek philosophers debating astronomy, Egyptian priests murmuring about temple offerings, Roman visitors comparing Nile floods to Tiber currents. Cleopatra listens, weaving in words when needed, her voice low and steady, threading knowledge through gossip like silk through linen. You recall a mainstream fact: she was fluent in several languages, including Greek and Egyptian, and even dabbled in Hebrew and Aramaic. Few monarchs before or after could match her linguistic dexterity. A servant pours fresh wine, and you lean back, belly warm, eyelids heavy. Around you, the music drifts into slower melodies, the dancers' motion softer now, like reeds swaying in a night breeze. Cleopatra's eyes gleam in the flickering light, calm yet calculating. Joke 3, you imagine she's secretly ranking who eats too fast, who drinks too much, and who might be easiest to blackmail tomorrow. As the evening wanes, the musicians fade, guests recline, and laughter softens into murmurs. Cleopatra rises, her indigo robe shifting like twilight silk. She bows slightly toward her company, a gesture both queenly and intimate, then slips away through a side door. The room feels emptier instantly, as if the air itself exhaled when she left. You follow her steps in thought, realizing that the true feast tonight was not lamb or figs, but the rare chance to taste her presence, sweet, sharp, intoxicating, and unforgettable. Morning arrives on velvet feet, and you follow Cleopatra through corridors hung with fresh garlands, where servants scatter petals as if the floor itself needs to blush. Today is a pageant day, the kind that turns children into headlines. You've seen the nursery softness. Now you watch it alloy into spectacle. Attendants adjust diadems no bigger than bracelets, miniature robes, stitched in a night of frantic needles. A seamstress yawns, hiding the pin still clenched between her lips. Cleopatra glides among them, calm as a temple pool. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, hover near her knees like two bright gems that learn to walk. Mainstream fact: in 34 BCE, during the so-called donations of Alexandria, Cleopatra and Mark Antony staged a ceremony in which their children were publicly crowned with far-flung titles. Alexander Helios declared King of Armenia, Media, and, ambitiously, Parthia. Cleopatra Selene named Queen of Cyrenaica and Libya. Little Ptolemy Philadelphus, born later than the twins, handed Syria, Cilicia, and Phoenicia, and Caesarion raised as King of Kings, with Cleopatra styled Queen of Kings. It was theater with sharp edges, pageantry that drew maps in midair and dared Rome to blink. The procession forms like a solar system. Priests in white linen carry gilt standards, Nubian guards with ostrich plumes pace in measured stride, musicians thread reed flute melodies through the colonnade like cool water. Then the children appear, Alexander Helios in garments touched with gold, the sun in a tunic, tiny rays stitched at the hem, Cleopatra Selene in pale silk edged with moon silver, a crescent comb pinned into the black night of her hair. Quirky tidbit. Some later retellings insist their outfits leaned into the pun of their names. Helios sun, Selene moon, so even illiterate onlookers could read the message. Whether or not the costumes were that literal, you feel the symbolism glow on your skin. You walk with the crowd into the gymnasium square, repurposed as a royal stage. Carpets unfurl, trumpets flare, and Antony, bronzed, broad-shouldered, theatrically Roman even in Alexandrian silk, takes his place beside the queen. The air tastes of dust and myrrh. Children perch on little thrones that look suspiciously like jewelry boxes with legs. Joke one murmurs through your head. Somewhere a carpenter's bragging, "Yes, I build chairs for people who still eat with their hands small." Cleopatra raises a hand, and the square hushes. She is diademed and serene. She looks like someone who could order the weather. The officiant intones titles. Gold glints. Crowns descend. You feel the moment crackle. Innocent faces under adult metal. Playtime renamed dominion. Historians still argue whether the donations were primarily a Hellenistic revival of Alexander-style kingship, Antony's jab at Octavian, or Cleopatra's masterpiece in crafting a dynastic myth Rome could neither ignore nor easily unmake. Perhaps all three braided into one glittering rope. Alexander Helios fidgets, he's still a child, and a nurse stealth slides a fig into his palm. He bites, a son with sticky chin. Cleopatra Selene sits very straight, eyes traveling the crowd as if measuring a future coastline only she can see. Cleopatra's gaze softens for a heartbeat, then steals. Love and propaganda learn to share a seat. Joke 2. If you ever feel your job is stressful, remember this kid just got future overlord of regions we don't control yet as a morning assignment. Mainstream fact threads tighter. By crowning the children with realms Antony had not fully conquered, Parthia most of all, the pair projected victory in advance, a Roman habit bent into Alexandrian theater, and by elevating Caesarion publicly as Julius Caesar's son, Cleopatra pricked the most sensitive skin in Rome. Octavian's claim to be Caesar's rightful heir, the square hears titles, Rome hears thunder, priests pour libations, incense strides upward. Antony declares grain remissions and temple gifts in honor of the little sovereigns, policy dressed as birthday presents, scribes scratched names and weights and districts. Somewhere an accountant sighs with the sorrow of columns that must now balance generosity against warehouses. Cleopatra leans toward Selene, whispering something that makes the girl's mouth lift, then toward Helios, straightening his tiny mantle with a flick that says, "Heads high, shoulders back, pretend your crown isn't itchy." Quirky detail circles. A court artisan demonstrates a miniature globe, a painted sphere no bigger than a melon, twirling it to show the children where their titles live. Little hands reach. Continents wobble. A servant lunges to prevent Libya rolling into the dust. The crowd laughs, relieved. Joke 3. Congratulations, Your Highness. You've dropped North Africa. Please pick it up and apologize to geography. Drums thrum, gifts cascade, lapis from the east, leopard skins from the south, Roman coins gathered from merchants who know when to look pleased. Cleopatra accepts each with the serene velocity of a banker, her mind ledgering meanings as quickly as weights. She is curating memory in real time, a city to witness, a rumor to export, a mosaic to leave in the eyes of every fisherman who will tell the story again at dusk. Historians still argue whether Alexandrian crowds adored this or merely tolerated the theater for its free festivals and debt relief. Some ancient voices call the spectacle glorious, others blasphemous. Roman pens predictably spit venom, sneering at an Eastern queen draping Roman might in silk. But if legitimacy is partly the art of letting people see it, Cleopatra is painting frescoes on the air. Antony lifts Alexander Helios to stand for the acclamation. The boy raises a tiny hand. The square erupts. Then Celine's turn. She doesn't wave. She inclines her head with a gravity that startles you into stillness. For a flicker, you glimpse a queen being carved inside a child, patient as a crescent eating into night. Later, history will peel fortunes from these children. Selene sent to Mauritania, Helios lost in Rome's shadows, but today the fiction holds. Egypt's future stands in gilded sandals, and the city pretends the horizon is a promise. Cleopatra steps forward for the final chord. She proclaims blessings in Egyptian, then repeats in Greek, two tongues plaited into a single ribbon that she ties around her family's story, perfume feathers through heat, pigeons launch like startled confetti, musicians chase the moment with bright scales. And then it is done. The crowns lifted off to be polished and locked, the children carried away to naps, the square reassembling into ordinary sunlight and gossip. As the crowd thins, you sense the undertow. This was not just a Mother's Pride Day. It was a declaration of alternate Rome, a map that dared to say hours in advance. The twins vanish into cool hallways, cushions, cups of watered wine. Cleopatra walks after them, barefoot now, leaving signatures of dust on the marble. The diadem still shines, but the shoulders beneath it have remembered their bones. You linger at the edge of the emptying square. Where the throne stood, only heat shimmers. Where trumpets bragged, sparrows argue over crumbs. Pageants pass, paperwork remains. Somewhere inside, a clerk begins drafting letters to cities newly promised royal attention. Somewhere in Rome, a young heir named Octavian will grind his teeth. And somewhere between the two, a queen counts what spectacle bought and what bill it is mailed to tomorrow. You wander with Cleopatra back into the palace, the echo of trumpets still jangling behind your ears like leftover festival noise. The corridor darkens, cooled by shaded awnings, and suddenly you step into a chamber hushed as a temple vault. This is where she keeps what kings fear, paper and ink. The library annex, cousin to the legendary one that burned and reburned, still swells with scrolls, codices, tablets, a forest of thought stacked into clay, papyrus, parchment. Cleopatra moves among them as if each shelf were a throne, fingertips brushing spines with the reverence of one priestess greeting another. Mainstream fact: Cleopatra was renowned not only for politics but for her scholarship. She spoke several languages, ancient sources name at least 9, and was said to be the only Ptolemaic ruler fluent in Egyptian, a tongue most of her ancestors neglected in favor of Greek. She could converse with diplomats without translators, debate philosophy with scholars, and read sacred texts firsthand. In a world where literacy itself was elite, she wielded it like a scepter. A clerk bows, holding out a scroll newly copied, Theophrastus on plants, Aristotle on animals, perhaps. She takes it, unrolls a segment, scans, nods. The motion is swift, as though her eyes drink text faster than water. Quirky tidbit. Later legends claim that when the Great Library lost volumes to fire, Cleopatra ordered ships in Alexandria's harbor searched, their cargoes of scrolls confiscated, copied, and added to the royal collection. Whether she truly turned docking vessels into emergency libraries, no one can prove. Still, the story clings like ink stains. Joke 1. Imagine being a trader thinking you're delivering olives only to discover you've accidentally become the Dewey Decimal System. She seats herself by a cedar table, scrolls unfurled, candles arranged, stylus poised. Children's laughter still echoes faintly from some far courtyard, but here the air is strict with wax and dust. You sit cross-legged, watching her glide through texts with the efficiency of someone who treats leisure as study disguised. You think of how queens are usually painted in armor, or jewels, or painted eyes. Here, she wears ink under her nails. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra genuinely engaged in deep scientific inquiry, or whether her reputation as a learned queen was exaggerated by propaganda and later romantic retellings. But even skeptical voices admit she understood enough mathematics, astronomy, and pharmacology to converse with the best minds of her age. The court physicians, scribes, and engineers all bowed to her, not just to her diadem, but to her ability to critique their work. She rolls open a medical papyrus. Sketches of herbs bloom across the fibers. Fennel, cumin, lotus, She traces a leaf with her nail, murmuring the dosage for childbirth, for headaches, for poison antidotes. You notice a servant hovering with a basket of fresh roots and pestle. Quirky tidbit, some traditions whisper she experimented with cosmetics as chemical tests, mixing minerals and oils not only for beauty but as controlled trials of chemistry. Powder and potion blurred. Eyeliner might double as antiseptic, rouge as stimulant. Joke 2, in short, her vanity desk could also pass peer review. At one point, she pauses over an astronomical chart, stars clustered, planets looped in epicycles. She marks a comet's course. You recall that comets often spelled doom to the ancients, but Cleopatra stares as if charting a future arrival she plans to greet personally. The candle flame trembles. The room itself seems to bend toward her concentration. A student scholar nervously recites a passage from Homer, voice wavering. Cleopatra corrects the meter, not unkindly, then continues writing. The scribe beams. Praise from a queen is scholarship's warm sun. She scratches notes into wax tablets quick as a sparrow, then translates a verse into Egyptian for fun, smiling at the sound of it rolling on her tongue. Joke 3. If Duolingo had existed, she would have finished the whole app in one sitting and written snarky footnotes. Mainstream fact deepens. Some sources claim Cleopatra herself authored treatises on cosmetics, weights and measures, and even medical remedies, though none survive intact. What we glimpse is a silhouette of authorship, references in later Byzantine texts that the Queen of Egypt wrote thus. To think of lost books with her name on them is to feel history's cruel erasures. Historians still argue whether her passion for knowledge was cultivated as genuine personal hunger or strategic image building, a queen adopting philosophers' robes to rival Athens and appeal to Roman intellectual pride. But watching her scratch lines across wax, eyes narrowed with focus, you doubt it was mere pose. Pose does not leave ink blotches across your knuckles, nor keep you bent long after the audience has left. The library breathes with her. Outside, a gull shrieks. Inside, you hear only the faint roll of papyrus, the scrape of stylus, the occasional clink of a lamp being adjusted. She reads a passage on governance, lips moving silently. Then she closes her eyes, repeats it from memory, nods. Her learning is not to impress, though it surely does, but to arm herself with language's shield and spear. At last, she leans back, rubbing her brow. The scrolls wait, patient mountains. A servant sets a dish of figs by her elbow, forgotten as she returns to a chart of tides. Somewhere, Mark Antony commands legions. Somewhere, Octavian sharpens speeches. Here, Cleopatra builds a citadel of paper. You realize this may be more than jewels or armies, is her truest wealth. The quiet ability to claim every voice before her, twist it, polish it, and use it as needed. Queenship inked, margin noted, whispered across centuries. The lamps gutter lower. She finally sets the stylus down, flexes her fingers, and smiles faintly. Enough for now, she murmurs. But you know she will be back. Words are her true banquet. She never really leaves the table. You shuffle from the echoing halls of scrolls into a chamber perfumed not with ink but with lavender and honeyed oils. This is Cleopatra at her most disarming, mistress of cosmetics and alchemy, where chemistry is cloaked in kohl. The mirrors are polished bronze, throwing back a queen whose power is framed by painted lids and scented skin. Servants hover with trays of alabaster jars, each carved with hieroglyphs, lotus, falcon, sun. You half expect one to sprout wings and fly. Mainstream fact, Cleopatra became legendary for her beauty rituals, though ancient writers hinted her magnetism was as much voice and wit as face. She bathed in milk, applied black coal eyeliner to ward off glare and eye infections, used malachite and galena powders, and softened skin with unguents steeped in rose and almond. To Egyptians, cosmetics were more than vanity. They were protection, ritual, even medicine. Cleopatra mastered all three, then spun them into myth. She dips her finger into a jar, smearing green malachite along her lower lid. The line gleams like fresh leaves after rain. A servant sprinkles powdered saffron into oil, stirring until golden. Cleopatra tests a dab on her wrist, nodding at the scent, part spice, part summer. Quirky tidbit. Records suggest Egyptians sometimes used crocodile dung as a sunscreen ingredient. Whether Cleopatra actually smeared reptile residue on herself or preferred something more refined, who can say? Joke 1. Imagine trying to flirt with Mark Antony while smelling faintly of swamp lizard. Talk about reptile dysfunction. A bronze mirror catches her smile. She experiments with blending pigments, lapis crushed fine, cinnabar diluted for a softer rouge. She instructs a maid to note the ratios, murmuring about consistency. It sounds more like a laboratory than a boudoir. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra herself devised these mixtures or whether her attendants did the alchemy while she merely approved, yet stories of her cosmetic treatises survive. Manuals later quoted by Byzantine authors, suggesting formulas for perfumes, skin salves, even hair treatments. She lifts a vial of perfume, amber liquid glowing in the lamplight. The scent unfurls. Myrrh, cardamom, cinnamon. Perfume here is not simply fragrance, it is diplomacy. The trail she leaves in a room lingers in memory, perhaps more persuasive than an argument. Quirky tidbit, Cleopatra supposedly owned a personal perfume factory near the Nile, producing her signature scent. Archaeologists have even tried recreating the recipe, a musky, resin-heavy fragrance. Joke 2. Basically, she invented celebrity perfume endorsement 2 millennia before modern billboards. Ode to Cleopatra, now available in Alexandria boutiques. She reclines, letting servants comb her hair with ivory picks, smoothing strands into a dark river down her back. Gold pins slide in, catching light like fireflies. She does not chatter. She listens as her attendants murmur gossip. Who was favored at court? Which Roman envoy blushed? Whose robe tore in public? Each tidbit is filed away like another pigment jar, useful when mixed properly. A bowl of donkey's milk is brought, frothing faintly. She dips her hand, rubs the cream into her skin. Mainstream fact returns. Donkey's milk baths were believed to soften and rejuvenate, rich in lactic acid. Whether Cleopatra truly bathed in entire tubs of the stuff, or whether that's a later exaggeration, it remains her most enduring beauty legend. Joke 3. You can picture her staff explaining the monthly milk budget. Yes, Your Majesty, the dairy herd is maxed out, but your elbows are luminous. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's fabled allure lay in her actual appearance or in the cultivated aura she engineered with these rituals. Coins depict a strong, aquiline profile, not a flawless goddess. Ancient Roman writers, hostile to her, painted her as manipulative. Others marveled at her charm. Likely the truth is subtler. Beauty as charisma, woven from scent, sound, confidence, and wit. She gestures for a small chest to be opened. Inside lie tiny jars of pigment, bright blue, deep red, shimmering gold dust. These are treasures of trade, travel from Afghanistan, Nubia, Phoenicia. Each color is a conquest without armies. She selects a speck of lapis, crushes it further, mixes with oil, and applies a delicate highlight above her brow. For a moment, her face is both art and weapon, framed by minerals dug from mountains hundreds of miles away. You realize this ritual is not idle vanity, it is armor. Where men don bronze, she dons coal and scent. Each layer is strategy. To appear youthful when fatigued, to dazzle in torchlight, to whisper power without uttering a word. The alchemy is psychological as much as chemical. She is queen of image, sculpting perception daily, and perception, after all, is empire's bedrock. The chamber fills with fragrance until your own head spins. Servants bow, satisfied, retreating. Cleopatra examines herself once more, adjusts a gold pin by a hair's breadth, then rises. She looks no different than she did an hour ago, and yet utterly transformed. That is her sorcery. You can't mark the change, but you feel it. The jars close, lids pressed snug, the chamber dims, but even as you leave, the perfume clings. You suspect it will haunt corridors long after she is gone. Beauty here is not fleeting, it's immortalized like ink on papyrus or milk poured into legend. The corridors hum with whispers of preparation, but this time the whispers are louder, sharper, almost like the sound of dice rattling in a hidden cup. You follow Cleopatra into a chamber dimly lit by oil lamps, their flames wavering as though nervous themselves. On the table before her rests a scattering of scrolls, ivory counters, and an array of tiny carved figures, ships, soldiers, lions. This is not cosmetics now. It is statecraft turned into theater, a queen rehearsing how to bend the greatest empire of her age. Mainstream fact. Cleopatra did not rule a quiet Egypt, but one caught in the storm of Roman civil wars. Her reign overlapped with Julius Caesar's rise and fall, and later with Mark Antony's clash against Octavian, who would become Augustus. Egypt was rich, its grain fields feeding Rome, its ports controlling Mediterranean trade. To the Romans, Egypt was a jewel, To Cleopatra, it was survival. A line with the wrong man, and Egypt could vanish like incense smoke. She picks up one carved soldier, moves it beside a tiny ship, her eyes narrow in thought. To some, these games might look like distractions, but you see calculation, the kind that never sleeps. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra actively manipulated Caesar and Antony to secure her throne, or whether she was cornered, forced into alliances with the only powers that could shield Egypt. What's certain is that she played the game, and for a time she won. A servant unrolls a map painted on papyrus. The Nile snaking green, Rome drawn in bold red strokes dotted with Latin letters. Cleopatra traces the Mediterranean with her finger. Her nail stops near Sicily, the place where Antony's fleets once faltered. She murmurs about wind, supplies, grain shipments, things generals obsess over. But here is a queen weighing them like cosmetics, blending power into survivable shades. Quirky tidbit: some sources claim Cleopatra once disguised herself in a rolled-up carpet, or perhaps a linen sack, so that she could be smuggled into Julius Caesar's chambers in Alexandria. The image has survived for centuries, a queen unrolling herself like a stage trick before Rome's most famous general. Joke 1. You picture the delivery servant muttering, "Nothing to see here, just a suspiciously queen-size carpet." She laughs softly now at a joke of her own, but it does not lighten the room. Her eyes gleam with the kind of humor born of high stakes. Julius Caesar, when alive, was her ally and lover. Together they had a son, Caesarion. That child, tiny when Rome still staggered from civil war, is now another pawn, another symbol. Cleopatra knows his bloodline could terrify Rome or bind it to Egypt if only the right marriage or proclamation aligned. She lifts another carved piece, this one a lion. She sets it beside the Nile, a reminder of her own image as the new Isis. Religion here is weaponized. Aligning herself with gods gave her legitimacy not only among Egyptians, but as a mystic figure even Romans could not entirely dismiss. Quirky tidbit 2. Coins minted under Cleopatra often showed her with features that some might consider masculine: strong jaw, hooked nose, stern gaze. Scholars debate whether this was accurate or propaganda, a way to project strength in a world where softness could be fatal. The lamps crackle. A messenger enters, bows, and reports news from Rome. Octavian consolidates power. Antony's supporters fracture. Cleopatra's face remains serene, but her hands press hard against the table. The ivory counters tremble. Joke 2. You imagine if Cleopatra had Twitter, her DMs would be an exhausting mix of Rome's greatest generals arguing like teenagers. She dismisses the messenger, then reclines briefly on a cushioned chair. She speaks in a low tone about Antony, his charm, his recklessness, his desperate need for affirmation. She knows how to flatter that need, how to turn his hunger for glory into protection for Egypt, but she also knows Rome is fickle. Today's ally is tomorrow's rival. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra truly loved Antony or merely tolerated him as a political necessity. Plays and poets call it romance. Strategists call it survival. Perhaps, like the coal around her eyes, it was both. Protection and allure intertwined. You watch as she arranges the carved ships into a crescent pattern. Her mind is at Actium already, though the battle has not yet come. She calculates wind currents, supply chains, morale. She is no mere ornament to Rome's ambitions. She is their partner, sometimes even their compass. Quirky tidbit 3. Plutarch claimed Antony and Cleopatra formed a society called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to nightly feasts and pranks, including disguising themselves and wandering Alexandria in the dark. Whether truth or slander, it shows how public imagination mingled strategy with spectacle. Joke 3. Basically, the ancient version of a power couple starting their own TikTok channel. Chaotic, glamorous, and way too influential. But the mirth does not linger. She knows feasting is only one side of survival. The other side is sharp as a blade. Antony must not only love her, he must fight for her. Caesarion must not only grow, he must be shielded. Egypt must not only dazzle, it must endure. The lamps burn lower. Cleopatra gathers the counters, sliding them into a lacquered box. Strategy rests, but not her mind. Even in sleep, she dreams of maneuvers, alliances, betrayals, and you realize that for all her painted eyes and scented hair, Cleopatra is most dangerous, not when she dazzles, but when she calculates. The air outside the chamber is warm with the scent of lotus and dust, but when you follow Cleopatra through another doorway, the mood shifts instantly. The room is heavy with perfumes, thicker than incense, a cloud of rose oil and myrrh so rich it clings to your skin. Here, politics wears a new costume, one of silk, silver goblets, and music drifting from lutes played just out of sight. This is the banquet hall, where Cleopatra turns appetite into diplomacy. Mainstream fact: Cleopatra's banquets became legendary in both Egyptian and Roman accounts, described as spectacles of wealth, excess, and sometimes deliberate shock. The most famous story tells of a wager she made with Mark Antony, boasting she could host the most expensive meal in history. When the feast appeared ordinary, Antony mocked her until she plucked a priceless pearl from an earring, dissolved it in vinegar, and drank it. With one swallow, she proved that extravagance could be measured not in dishes, but in daring. You can almost see her now, reclining on a gilded couch, indigo robe flowing like river water, Antony at her side. She lifts a cup, eyes sparkling as though the wine itself carries secrets. Around her, tables overflow with roasted birds, honeyed dates, fish garnished with herbs. Servants glide silently, refilling cups, removing plates. Yet you know the food is only half the story. The true feast is power dressed as indulgence. Quirky tidbit: some accounts claim Cleopatra trained her fleet of servants to perform elaborate skits and pantomimes during banquets, complete with disguises, riddles, and sometimes mocking portrayals of Roman senators. Historians still argue whether these tales are exaggerated slanders from her enemies or genuine glimpses of her flair for theater. Joke 1. Imagine being a Roman envoy, chewing nervously on figs, while an Egyptian actor parades by wearing a fake toga and pretending to argue about taxes. Antony, broad-shouldered and bearded, leans closer to Cleopatra, his laughter booming but edged with insecurity. He adores these displays, not just for their beauty, but because they flatter him. He is the chosen guest, the co-star in this rolling pageant. Cleopatra knows this well. Her glance lingers on him just long enough, her words sharp enough to remind him that her company is privilege, not guarantee. Historians debate whether Antony was her equal or her instrument, but in this moment you can sense she is both, his muse and his mirror. The banquet roars with music. A dancer spins, saffron scarf catching lamplight, while guests clap softly. Cleopatra raises her hand, and the hall stills. She makes her wager about the costliest meal. Antony smirks, expecting some grand exotic dish. The food is good, but not outrageous. Whispers ripple. Has the queen lost her touch? Then she lifts her earring, the pearl glowing faintly in the lamplight, drops it into vinegar. The liquid hisses softly. The pearl dissolves. She drinks it in one slow, deliberate swallow. Silence holds the room, broken only by Antony's astonished laugh. The queen wins. Again. Joke 2. You imagine a poor scribe tasked with recording this moment, scribbling, "Note: pearl cocktails are not recommended for daily consumption." Cleopatra reclines, satisfied, though not merely for vanity. This was theater designed to remind Antony and any Roman who would repeat the tale that her wealth could rival and even humble the might of Rome. Egypt was not a province. It was a kingdom of spectacle, where value was measured not in coins, but in symbols. Quirky tidbit 2. Later Roman writers insisted that the pearl in question was worth 10 million sesterces, enough to fund an army. Was it true? Hard to say. Some scholars suggest vinegar could not dissolve a pearl so quickly, that perhaps the story was exaggerated to humiliate Antony by association. Historians still argue whether the whole episode was reality or legend, but the fact that it survived proves how deeply it branded itself into memory. The feast resumes, louder than before. Antony drinks deeply, emboldened, while Cleopatra smiles faintly, already moving to her next calculation. The music swells. Roasted goose arrives. Servants bring trays of figs glistening like jewels. Joke 3. You picture Cleopatra leaning over to Antony and whispering, "By the way, you're paying for this one." As the evening wanes, guests recline heavy with wine and stories. Cleopatra alone seems untouched, her mind spinning behind the coal-lined mask of her face. She has demonstrated not only wealth but control over perception, over narrative, even over Antony's pride. Tomorrow, Rome may scoff, but tonight she has woven another layer into the legend of Egypt's queen. When the final cups are drained and the torches burn low, She rises, servants rush to clear the tables, dancers vanish into shadows, the hall empties. Only Antony lingers, gazing at her with both awe and unease. Cleopatra smiles, a smile that holds promises and warnings, honey and iron in equal measure. You follow her as she leaves the banquet behind. Outside, the night air feels cool, almost cleansing after so much perfume and heat. Yet the echo of laughter and music trails you, a reminder that even in revelry, Cleopatra is never at rest. Every pearl, every cup of wine, every carefully staged gesture is part of a larger play, one in which survival is measured in stories that outlast the night. The palace grows quieter as the echoes of the banquet fade, but Cleopatra's stage never truly closes. You follow her into a smaller chamber, walls painted with falcons and lotuses, a room lit not by torches but by a handful of oil lamps that cast golden halos on plaster. Here, the queen prefers to speak softly, surrounded not by dancers or generals, but by scrolls and maps. This is the library chamber, her second throne room, where words are weapons as sharp as spears. Mainstream fact, Cleopatra was famed for her education. She was the first in her dynasty to master the Egyptian tongue, along with Greek and reportedly several other languages, including Hebrew, Aramaic, and even some Ethiopian dialects. Ancient writers marveled at her ability to negotiate without interpreters, a skill that gave her enormous advantage in diplomacy. Imagine a Roman envoy stammering through a translator while Cleopatra answers him directly in flawless Latin. No delay, no filter, only her voice carrying power. You watch her now, reclining, not with jewels, but with a scroll unrolled across her lap. Her robe is plain saffron linen, her hair loose, the queen stripped of stagecraft, yet still magnetic. She traces a finger over a map of the Nile Delta, murmuring about trade routes and grain shipments. Egypt's lifeblood is agriculture, and Cleopatra knows the weight of each harvest, each barge of wheat destined for Rome's hungry belly. Quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest Cleopatra studied medicine as well as politics. Rumors whispered she experimented with herbal remedies, cosmetics, and even mild poisons, not necessarily to kill but to understand. Was that eyeliner protecting her eyes from glare or masking medicinal compounds? Historians still argue whether she truly dabbled in pharmacology or whether later writers painted her as an enchantress to undermine her intellect. Joke 1, you picture her writing notes in the margin of a medical scroll, recipe for eyeliner, do not drink. Antony enters, slower this time, wine still heavy in his step. He watches her as though she were both lover and oracle. You make Rome tremble with feasts, he teases, but you win empires with ink. Cleopatra smiles faintly, not denying it. She explains grain tallies, the loyalty of Egyptian priests, the shifting alliances of Greek city-states. Her voice is calm, deliberate, as though she's less queen than scholar tutoring a distracted student. Antony nods, feigning comprehension, though you suspect he understands only part of what she spins. The scroll in her hands shifts. Now poetry, verses of Homer. She recites lines, her voice rich, eyes gleaming as she glances at Antony. He grins, amused, perhaps moved, though not in the same way she is. For him, the poetry is ornament. For her, it is legacy, connecting her Ptolemaic line to Alexander, to Troy, to the myths that anchor power deeper than armies. Quirky tidbit 2, later writers claimed Cleopatra's voice itself was enchanting, described not as sweet, but multifaceted, able to adapt like music to every listener. Some scholars think this meant she was a skilled orator, able to adjust tone and rhythm depending on her audience. Historians still argue whether this was natural charm or carefully trained performance. Joke 2, you think maybe she was just really good at karaoke. The lamps flicker, a servant brings figs and watered wine, setting them quietly beside her. Cleopatra gestures Antony closer, sharing fruit between words of strategy. This intimacy is not seduction, it is alliance, sealed with shared food and whispered plans. She asks him what Rome truly wants, not in public, not in senatorial decrees, but in the private corridors where power is traded. Antony shrugs, then admits, Rome wants Egypt's grain, Egypt's gold, and perhaps Egypt's queen. Cleopatra tilts her head, the faintest smirk tugging her lips. Rome may take the first two, she murmurs, but the third is not theirs to claim. Her laughter, low and brief, fills the chamber. Joke 3, you imagine Cleopatra writing that line down later, as if saving it for her memoirs, underlined twice for effect. The night deepens. Outside, Alexandria sleeps under starlight, but inside this room, minds stay sharp. Cleopatra reads aloud a passage from Aristotle, pausing to debate its meaning. Antony tries to keep up, but soon reclines, lulled by her voice. He listens less to the words than to the cadence, as though the queen's scholarship itself is music. Cleopatra notices, but she does not scold. His weakness only sharpens her role. At last, she rolls the scroll closed, sets it aside, and leans back. The oil lamps sputter, casting shadows like ink on the walls. Her eyes gleam, reflecting not just flame, but the fire of relentless thought. She has drunk pearls, commanded fleets, spoken tongues of empires, and here in the quiet she studies, planning how to outlast even Rome. When Antony finally drifts to sleep, Cleopatra still lingers awake, tracing her finger over the map of Egypt once more. Every river bend, every temple, every caravan route, she holds them in her mind like jewels on a crown. Outside, the Mediterranean whispers against the shore. You realize that for Cleopatra, night is not rest but rehearsal. Tomorrow's strategies are already etched in her thoughts. Dawn slides into the palace with the hush of rose-colored light, yet Cleopatra does not greet it in bed. Instead, you find her on a shaded terrace, its columns tangled with ivy, overlooking the sea where gulls carve lazy arcs. She holds not a goblet this time, but a small ivory box. From it, she lifts polished gems, emeralds, amethysts, sapphires, glimmering like captive stars. Cleopatra's treasury is no mere hoard of vanity. Each stone, each coin, each ingot is a weapon in a world where silver can outlast swords. Mainstream fact: Cleopatra inherited a kingdom both wealthy and burdened by debt. The Ptolemaic dynasty had long relied on Egypt's grain exports and control of trade routes. She, however, took a more personal hand, inspecting accounts, regulating taxes, and even monitoring temple revenues. Records hint at reforms where farmers' grain quotas were adjusted to prevent rebellion, balancing imperial demands with local survival. You picture her bending over wax tablets, calculating, her nails tapping like drumbeats of empire. Beside her now, accountants unfurl papyrus scrolls, neat columns of figures marching across fibers. She listens, nods, and interrupts with pointed questions that make even veteran scribes sweat. Cleopatra knows exactly how much silver a delayed shipment costs, how many soldiers a missing caravan could feed. A queen as bookkeeper may not sound glamorous, but here in the palace's veins of wealth, power hums louder than feasts. Quirky tidbit: coins minted during her reign sometimes bore her image paired with Antony's, both faces etched side by side. Some historians think she insisted on this as a statement of equality, presenting herself as more than consort, as co-ruler. Others argue the pairing was propaganda meant to soothe Roman egos. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra truly held equal power beside Antony or whether her coinage was clever marketing. Joke one, either way, it was the ancient version of a couple's selfie printed on money. The terrace grows warmer as the sun climbs, and Cleopatra gestures for shade screens to be drawn. Servants pour pomegranate juice into silver cups, the tart scent cutting through the numbers. Antony arrives late, yawning, still smelling faintly of last night's wine. He squints at the papyrus and jokes, "Let Rome burn its ledgers. Why must Egypt tally every fig?" Cleopatra smiles without humor, replying, "Because Rome eats those figs, and without them, Rome starves." His grin falters. She turns to the jewel box again, selecting a pearl, its sheen like captured moonlight. Rumors claim she tested gems not just for adornment, but for barter, gifts, or even bribes. In this age, loyalty can be purchased as easily as it can be betrayed. Cleopatra weighs the pearl in her palm, then sets it down with deliberate care. Quirky tidbit 2. Later writers spun tales of Cleopatra dissolving pearls in vinegar to impress Antony, though scientists debate whether the chemistry could truly work. Historians still argue whether the story was literal, exaggerated, or purely metaphorical, designed to portray her as decadent beyond belief. Joke 2. You imagine her trying the trick once, the pearl refusing to melt, and her muttering, "Oh, fine, I'll just wear it." Accountants drone, numbers piling like sand. Cleopatra, however, remains patient. She asks about Syria, about the caravan tolls, about gold shipments from Nubia. Each answer folds into her mind. You realize that while Antony wins loyalty with charisma, Cleopatra buys survival with detail. She is both merchant and monarch. Her treasury is much a battlefield as Actium will one day be. At her side, a tray of rings gleams, each inset with gems. They are more than jewelry. Signet seals, tools to stamp decrees and contracts. She slips one on, then another, testing their weight, as though deciding which fate to sign today. Antony watches, bemused, and remarks, "Do you ever tire of counting?" She answers softly, "Only when others forget what is being counted." Joke 3. You picture her scribbling sarcastic notes in the margin of her accounts. Remind Antony, wine costs money too. By mid-morning, the papyrus is rolled, the gems returned, the seals tucked away. Cleopatra rises, her saffron robe catching sunlight like a spill of fire. She steps to the terrace edge, gazing at the Mediterranean where ships shift like beetles across the water. Each one is a vein carrying wealth in or bleeding it out. For Cleopatra, the sea itself is a ledger, and she balances it in her mind. Below, Alexandria stirs, markets buzzing, camels groaning, vendors calling. The queen listens as though the city's clamor is another form of accounting, a living measure of her people's prosperity. For a heartbeat she smiles, perhaps proud, perhaps weary. The empire rests not only on her shoulders, but on her arithmetic, her jewels, her stubborn refusal to let Rome feed for free. The sun blazes higher. Cleopatra turns, robes sweeping, her treasury secured in ink and gems. The queen who feasts in splendor, who whispers poetry, who tangles with emperors. She is also the queen who counts. And sometimes counting is the sharpest crown of all. Afternoon heat shimmers over Alexandria, the stones of the palace courtyard glowing like embers. Cleopatra, however, has retreated into a chamber where shadows cling like loyal attendants. Here, scrolls and reed pens are laid out in deliberate disorder, a battlefield of ink and strategy. You realize quickly this is no idle study. This is Cleopatra's propaganda workshop, where images and stories are sharpened into weapons as deadly as spears. Mainstream fact, Cleopatra was fluent in many languages, rare among the Ptolemies, who usually clung to Greek. She could address emissaries in their own tongue, from Ethiopians to Hebrews to Parthians, making diplomacy not only easier but far more persuasive. Language here is her stagecraft. Today she dictates to scribes, her voice steady, weaving phrases that praise Egypt's abundance, Rome's strength, and her role as the golden bridge between them. Quirky tidbit. Some surviving coins depict her not as the delicate beauty later myths suggest, but with a strong nose and angular jaw, features exaggerated to emphasize authority. Historians still argue whether these portraits were true likenesses or stylized masks meant to project power. Joke 1. If Cleopatra had access to modern filters, you suspect she'd have one set for ruling and another for Instagram. On the wall hangs a painted panel. Cleopatra dressed as Isis, goddess of motherhood and magic, arms outstretched in eternal embrace. Such imagery blurs queen with deity, mortal with divine. Visitors to the court would not merely meet a ruler, they would meet a living goddess, cloaked in saffron and emerald. Cleopatra leans against this backdrop now, a calculated gesture dictating lines about harmony between heaven and earth. The scribes nod reverently, quills scratching furiously. At her feet, trays of papyrus await dispatch. Some will ride with couriers to distant provinces, reminding governors of her generosity. Others will slip into Roman hands, whispering tales of abundance and loyalty. Cleopatra understands the oldest truth. Perception is reality, and reality can be bent. Quirky tidbit 2. Roman poets later described her barge on the Nile with sails of purple silk, oars of silver, and servants fanning her with peacock feathers. Historians still argue whether this spectacle was truth or myth, exaggerated by Roman propaganda to paint her as dangerously luxurious. Joke 2. You picture Cleopatra reading those verses centuries later, chuckling, "Silver oars, I wish." A servant enters with a small chest of cosmetics, coal, crushed malachite, cinnabar. Cleopatra does not merely use them for vanity. She knows presentation itself is propaganda. A dab of black coal sharpens her gaze. A brush of red makes her lips command silence or laughter as she chooses. Even her face is a message. She studies her reflection in a bronze mirror, then instructs the scribe to write, "A queen's beauty is a gift to her people." You smirk at her subtlety, half compliment to herself, half policy statement. Antony bursts in suddenly, clattering with wine-soaked energy, and laughs at the scrolls. "Do you mean to win battles with ink, my queen?" Cleopatra tilts her head, answering, "Ink lasts longer than blood." He falters, not expecting her sharpness. You note the silence that follows is heavier than his armor ever will be. Joke 3. You imagine Cleopatra running a palace newsletter titled The Nile Times, featuring headlines like Queen outsmarts Roman senator again, details inside. The scribes roll the scrolls, tie them with silk cords, and mark them with seals pressed from her jeweled rings. Couriers bow, waiting like arrows about to fly. Cleopatra lifts one sealed scroll, kisses it lightly, and hands it over. You sense she knows each piece of propaganda is both a promise and a gamble, a story loosed into the wild currents of empire. As the chamber empties, Cleopatra lingers. She stares once more at her painted likeness as Isis, then at her ink-stained fingers. The queen, the goddess, the writer, the myth, she is all of them, and none. History will choose what to believe. For now, she sharpens her narrative as carefully as any sword, because in a world where Rome watches, Cleopatra must be more than herself. She must be legend. Outside, cicadas shrill in the heat, indifferent to scrolls or myths, but within the chamber, a woman spins herself into eternity with ink, imagery, and willpower. You exhale slowly, realizing that Cleopatra doesn't just fight wars or count treasures. She tells the story, and in telling, she wins. Night deepens over Alexandria, the harbor, lamps flickering like stars scattered across black water. Cleopatra walks alone along a palace balcony, the hem of her indigo robe whispering over stone, her gold bangles catching stray moonlight. You sense this is not solitude by accident. She is rehearsing a kind of performance, the art of being seen even in silence. Down below, servants pretend to busy themselves, but their eyes rise, catching her silhouette against the glow of the sea. Mainstream fact: Cleopatra often staged her entrances and appearances as carefully as military maneuvers. Roman historians described how she would meet dignitaries aboard gilded barges or in chambers perfumed with incense, her every movement calculated to enchant. Tonight, she lingers at the balcony rail, gazing outward, aware that every glance, every gesture is theater. Quirky tidbit: records suggest Cleopatra wore custom-blended perfumes crafted from exotic resins and herbs imported from Arabia and India. Her personal fragrance, some believe, was so distinctive that Roman visitors carried traces of it home on their cloaks. Historians still argue whether these perfumes were subtle or overpowering. Did she smell like a divine mystery or like an herb shop on fire? Joke 1. You imagine someone sneezing their way through a diplomatic meeting, declaring, "Yes, my queen, very enchanting, but my sinuses surrender first." She pauses, resting her chin on her hand, considering the stories already spiraling about her in Rome. Temptress, sorceress, threat. Cleopatra understands the paradox. Her enemies' lies only make her more unforgettable. In a strange way, she feeds off their gossip, bending it toward her own myth. Tonight, she wonders aloud to the stars, will they remember me as queen or as illusion? The sea answers only with the lap of waves. Inside, musicians begin a slow tune on flutes and drums. Cleopatra turns, slipping back into the chamber where Antony reclines heavily on cushions. He is half asleep, wine staining his lips, armor discarded in the corner like a sulking child. Cleopatra kneels beside him, strokes his hair, and murmurs in Greek, a language they share. He stirs, smiles faintly, and mutters something about Rome. You watch her eyes harden a moment. Rome is always there, even in dreams. Joke 2. You picture Cleopatra writing Rome in a burned book with doodles of crocodiles biting senators. A servant brings papyrus sheets covered in sketches, designs for her next public procession. Chariots with golden wheels, servants dressed as minor gods, fountains spraying rosewater. Cleopatra studies them, weighing which details are spectacle and which are folly. She taps one with her ring finger. Too much gold on the chariot, she says. It risks looking desperate. Better elegance than excess. Even in spectacle, moderation whispers louder. Quirky tidbit 2. It is said Cleopatra once entered a meeting with Caesar rolled up in a rug, carried by servants, unrolled at his feet in dramatic reveal. Historians still argue if this is fact or Roman embellishment, but the story survives precisely because it is so theatrical. Joke 3. You suspect if rugs had zippers, Cleopatra would have pioneered the world's first Tada sleeping bag entrance. She dismisses the servants, leaving only a single lamp glowing, flame trembling with the night breeze. Cleopatra sits cross-legged, unrolling a map of the Mediterranean. She traces with her finger the routes of grain ships leaving Egypt, lifelines feeding Rome's swelling appetite. Her lips tighten. She knows her true weapon is not spectacle, nor perfume, nor whispered rumors. It is food. Without Egypt's grain, Rome starves. And as long as she controls the Nile's bounty, she holds leverage greater than armies. You sense the queen's weariness pressing in, though. Every glance, every gesture, every rumor managed. Exhaustion hides under her painted lids. She rubs her temples, smudging a faint line of kohl, and sighs. For a flicker of a moment, she is not queen nor goddess, not spectacle nor myth, just a woman enduring the weight of history's gaze. But then the lamp flutters, shadows dance, and she straightens her spine again. Cleopatra knows the world is watching, even if that world is asleep across the sea. And so she resumes her performance, her legend, her careful dance on the balcony, framed by the eternal sea and the whispers of the night. Dawn crawls across the water with a thin metallic light, and you taste brine on your tongue before the wind decides whose banner it favors. The world has narrowed to masts and canvas, and the long, taut breath that fleets hold just before history chooses. You stand on the quarterdeck of Cleopatra's flagship, a big-bellied, many-oared creature, painted, perfumed, and bristling with bright bronze, and watch the Gulf of Ambracia harden into a chessboard. Out there, beyond the sheen of early sun, Octavian's Admiral Agrippa has stitched a net of ships across the straits. Behind you, Antony's line forms up, heavy with pride and heavier with indecision. The water smells of tar, fish, and the faint ghost of cinnamon oil rubbed into oars to keep them from groaning like old men. Mainstream fact, this is 31 BCE, the Battle of Actium, the sea fight that will break the triangle of Antony, Cleopatra, and Rome into something simpler and crueler. Antony commands around 200 massive quinqueremes, towers afloat that promise brawn. Agrippa handles the quicker, more maneuverable Liburnians that promise brains. Cleopatra is here, not as rumor but as reality, commanding the Egyptian reserve, 60 swift ships with purple sails and reputations that have already fought 2 campaigns without loosing an arrow, spectacle and supply. The morning wind runs light and fickle. On Cleopatra's deck, soldiers adjust linen corselets. Rowers stretch hands already raw from rehearsals. You feel the ship's heartbeat in their oars, a muffled thud traveling the length of the hull. At the stern, under a purple awning, Cleopatra watches in silence, chin lifted, the kohl at her eyes drawn steady as a vow. Her perfume is a memory here. Salt air steals such luxuries. This is not a banquet, this is arithmetic. Quirky tidbit slides on the breeze. Some later writers swore Cleopatra's sails were so saturated with perfume that opposing sailors smelled her before they saw her, rose and myrrh drifting ahead like a herald. Today, the only promise in the air is kelp and caution. Joke one nudges you. If any fragrance survives this fight, it'll be ode to anxiety. Antony rides down his line in a fast boat, shouting encouragement in a voice that once rallied legions. He bleeds charisma, but you can smell the tremor beneath. Grain shortages, desertions, a Roman enemy who has stolen the Adriatic like a purse. He halts alongside Cleopatra's ship, looks up, and for a heartbeat he is just a man asking a woman to trust him. She nods once, trust, but not surrender. The nod says, we prepared an exit. The nod says, do not force me to use it. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra urged Antony to fight at sea to preserve supply lines and her ships, or whether Antony chose unwisely out of pride, gambling heavy hulls against Agrippa's better seamanship. They also argue whether she came to Actium to stiffen his resolve, or to guard Egypt's treasure with a fleet that could bolt if Rome's weather turned. What no one argues is the result. Noon would crown a new master, and the sea would do the coronation. The first rams hit with a sick, splintering sound like gods snapping lutes. Firepots arc, hissing. Arrows stitch black commas into mourning. Antony's front line presses. Agrippa feints and reels, refusing the crush, hunting flanks instead. On your deck, the captain calls stroke. The rowers obey. The hull shudders. Oars bite, release, bite again. Sun climbs. Sweat salts lips. Time becomes a drum you can't stop hearing. You glance at Cleopatra, still composed, but her eyes flicker like a reader counting too many lines at once. Ships burn on the periphery, plumes writing ugly new constellations in daylight. Messenger boats flit between admirals like anxious swallows. From the south, finally, a wind sharpens. Sails belly. Cleopatra's gaze slides to the open mouth of the Gulf, toward the long throat of escape. Somewhere in that direction lies Egypt. Somewhere there, grain, children, a crown, and a mausoleum already half stocked with treasure and plans. Quirky tidbit. Later stories claim she had a fireproof refuge prepared in Alexandria's mausoleum, ready for last-ditch bargaining or last-ditch blaze. Whether blueprint or boasting, it tells you how often she rehearsed catastrophe. Antony's flagship signals a pivot that looks like attack but smells of calculation. Then the signal you dread and half expected, Cleopatra's squadron unfurls more canvas, swings into a tight V and surges for the gap, not a skitter of panic, an organized tear through the net while it's weakest. Your stomach drops with the bow. The Egyptian line cleaves the sunlight like a school of silverfish, oars rising in a choreographed glitter, rams are sheathed, sails thunder. Joke 2 arrives with unwelcome timing. You remember the pearl and vinegar stunt and think, if dissolving gems was the most expensive dinner, this is the most expensive Irish exit in history. Antony sees the purple sails flee in a decision that will haunt tombs, rips his flagship from the scrum to follow. He abandons battle to chase a woman and a lifeline. Men on the decks behind him stare, cheer, curse, or simply gape with salt-stung eyes as their general's wake becomes a verdict. Agrippa's smaller ships slash into the confusion. Antony leaves, knives into cloth. Flames climb rigging. The thunder of ram against hull becomes metronome of defeat. Mainstream fact folds its cold sheet over the scene. Antony and Cleopatra break out with a fraction of their fleet and run south. Behind them, their remaining squadrons fight on, some surrendering, some burning. Octavian does not need to win gloriously. He only needs Antony to lose unmistakably. Actium gives him that, and propaganda enough to feed Rome for years. On your ship, wind whips the purple into a hard sky. Rowers collapse and rise, gasp and pull. The sea darkens from bright tin to bruised iron. Cleopatra stands steady, eyes forward, Egyptward. No triumph in her face, only the stark clarity of survival. She has chosen life over legend's neat endings, logistics over honor's burning wreath. Historians still argue whether this retreat was prudence or betrayal, the rational preservation of Egypt's sovereign, or the fatal crack that made Antony's army crumble. History prefers clean heroes and villains. The sea rarely obliges. Night closes. Stars switch on like 1,000 watching jurors. The wake glows faintly with plankton, a ghost road pointing home. Antony staggers aboard Cleopatra's ship hours later, salt-bitten and stunned, and she does not scold. She brings water, then wine, then maps. Grief, later, math, now. How much grain remains, how many ships intact, which ports loyal, which governors bribable, how quickly Octavian can push a victory into a march. The room fills with the smell of wet rope and wax. The future shrinks to columns of numbers. Joke 3 peeks in, thin and necessary. You imagine Cleopatra scribbling a palace memo. New policy, no more sea battles where our plan B is run faster. The long sail south becomes a corridor of reckoning. On deck, soldiers stare at the horizon with the hollow eyes of men who have misplaced a continent. Below, clerks tally, tally, tally. Cleopatra sleeps in snatches, cheek pressed to maps, waking to whisper orders to the helmsman, the quartermaster, the one scribe who can still keep his ink from shaking. She does not mention gods. She mentions sailcloth, biscuit, water casks, and the bribes that will make small towns loyal for one more week. Egypt is a series of practicalities you must chain together before Octavian's clean sandals darken your doorstep. When Alexandria's lighthouse finally lifts its calm fire on the rim of the world, you feel relief like warm bread in an empty belly. The city blooms from haze, white blocks, blue harbor, shouts leaping dock to dock. Cleopatra straightens, pulls the salt from her hair with quick, impatient fingers, and squares her shoulders. Actium is not a story she will tell. It is a stain she will answer. She orders stores opened, ships refitted, messengers racing up the Nile like bright fish. If defeat is a tide, she will meet it with levies of coin, ink, and will. And yet, Under the brisk orders, you hear it, the faint crack in the queen's music. Not panic, she lost that capacity years ago, but the knowledge that the river now runs downhill faster than before. She touches the railing once, as if feeling the city's pulse through stone, then walks down the gangplank without looking back. The sea behind her keeps its secrets. The city before her demands solutions. You step after her into sun and dust and the hard work of pretending that the horizon has not already voted. Alexandria wakes to the sound of hammers, repairs, fortifications, the practical percussion of a city bracing for the knock at its door. You walk beside Cleopatra through courtyards newly crowded with crates and soldiers, past scribes running like ants with papyrus under their arms, past priests murmuring prayers that sound suspiciously like inventory lists for the gods. The queen moves quickly, her braid tight, her voice tighter. Actium is now a bruise you stop rubbing because it hurts less to work than to think. Mainstream fact: in the months after Actium, Octavian closed his grip, marching through the east while Antony's supporters fell away like leaves. When his fleet and legions finally loomed over Alexandria in 30 BCE, the city became the last bright coin in Cleopatra's purse. She had prepared. She knew cities are not defended only by walls, but by what the defender is willing to burn. You follow her into the royal mausoleum, a stone dream built while its occupants still breathed, part monument, part panic room. Torches throw honeyed light over gold heaped like a legend. Coffers, statues, vessels, a hurricane of treasure stilled by walls. Quirky tidbit: later stories insist she stored not just wealth here, but tinder, pitch, maybe even quick burning oils. Determined that if Egypt must die, Rome would claim ashes scented with kyphi. Historians still argue whether the burn-it-all plan was real strategy or theatrical rumor sharpened by Roman pens. Either way, the mausoleum is an answer she keeps in reserve, a locked sentence with otherwise underlined. Antony is here too, thinner in spirit than you've ever seen him. He tries to joke about pearls and vinegar, remember our most expensive dinner, but the punchline won't form. Cleopatra stands close without touching, the space between them crowded by history's elbows. They speak in fragments. Ships you still have, men we can trust, gates that hold, gates that won't. She does not cry. She cross-examines reality until it can't lie. Mainstream fact returns like a tide. She sends Caesarians south along the Nile, away from the city, away from Octavian's future. You must be a river now, she might whisper, silent and unstoppable. You watch the boy disappear into glare and reeds, and you hear the hinge of empire creak. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra hesitated or acted instantly regarding Caesarion, whether his escape was her idea or last-minute scramble. The outcome chills the room. Octavian later had him killed, with a Roman quip to justify it: there can be only one Caesar. In the city, rumors swarm. Some say Cleopatra practices with poisons. Others say she bargains with gods. A few insist she's engraving new treaties on her own bones. She meets Octavian's envoys with quiet irony, offering gifts, promises math. You can almost see her thinking, if perception is reality, perhaps I can still sell the better one. But Rome no longer haggles. Rome tallies. Antony rides out for a final clash and comes back broken. The exact choreography blurs. False reports, the dust-colored logic of soldiers choosing winners before battles end. He falls on his sword, a Roman punctuation mark where his story refuses to coil neatly. The wound is offstage here, no gore, only the echo of it. He is brought to the mausoleum, to her, as she had ordered the door sealed. They haul him up by ropes as if he were both man and memory being hoisted inside. Cleopatra cradles him. The torchlight ripples across his face. The silence does the rest. Joke one arrives like a leaf in wind, almost too small to catch. Somewhere a sycophant insists, "You look well, General." And Cleopatra, without turning, murmurs, "Not now." Outside, Octavian's footsteps draw near, careful, managerial, inevitable. Inside, Cleopatra counts again. Options, hours, the number of small, unremembered gestures she still owes her children. She sends for a basket of figs, fruit as decoy, as comfort, as rumor's cradle. Quirky tidbit: the tale that an asp hid in that basket has survived 2 millennia, a snake coiled around the world's imagination. Historians still argue whether she used an Egyptian cobra, a poison salve, a hairpin dipped in aconite, or merely allowed myth to do what venom does anyway, stop the heart. She does not rush. She bathes, milk again because legends deserve consistency, braids her hair, sets on a plain diadem that shines like a quiet decision. She writes letters, one for Octavian, polite, barbed with dignity, one for her children, soft, stern, and impossibly brave. She asks 2 loyal attendants to remain. Your own breath slows, matching hers. The room seems to inhale and forget how to exhale. Sss. Mainstream fact, cold and steady. Octavian found her dead, or nearly so, within the mausoleum, and ordered her buried with Antony. Egypt fell, Rome rebranded. Cleopatra's line ended in marble and adopted heirs. Yet the manner of her death is the part no empire could annex. It belongs to rumor, to theater, to the way a queen directs her exit as carefully as any entrance. Joke 2 glints, the last candle of levity. She might have whispered, "At least I won't smell like crocodile sunscreen for this." And her attendants rolled their eyes through tears. Joke 3 drifts in like a feather. Imagine the asp refusing duty. "Sorry, Majesty, Union rules," he. And Cleopatra arching a brow until even a snake understood stage directions. The attendants weep quietly. You stand back, listening to the softest noises left in a palace, the tick of cooling lamps, the hush of linen, the faraway sigh of the sea. Cleopatra reclines as if for a final salon. Kohl still precise, mouth relaxed, a woman who has spent her last hour curating legacy. She is not asleep. She is a story becoming stone. Historians still argue whether she was the last pharaoh or the first truly modern ruler of image, whether she fell to Rome or outlived it by conquering its memory. You suspect she'd prefer the verdict carved in present tense, "I endure." The asp, the hairpin, the salve, choose your ending. The important part is the aftertaste. A queen who knew that to survive in story is also to win a kind of empire that armies cannot audit. Octavian arrives, tidy as a ledger, and finds what he feared and perhaps desired, a finale he cannot stage. He orders honors, makes speeches, pockets Egypt, and sails away to rename himself Augustus, the august man, and his peace the pax. But when night moves through Rome, the wind sometimes smells faintly of myrrh and river silt, and a rumor like silk drifts down alleys. She smiled. You can almost hear the oars of a purple-sailed barge somewhere off the Tiber, cutting water that isn't there. You step back from the mausoleum door as the stone sighs shut. The torches outside flicker. The city breathes. The river keeps its counsel, and you carry with you the lingering heat of a life that refused to cool politely. Cleopatra exits, but not quietly. Now the sounds soften, as though the whole city pulls a blanket to its chin. The sea hushes its silver breathing. The lighthouse blinks more slowly. The gardens trade their bright perfumes for the deeper scent of watered earth. You stand at a balcony that remembers footsteps and listeners and secrets, and below, the harbor purls like a cat easing into sleep. The air is warm but friendly, the kind that loosens your shoulders and asks nothing more than a long, unhurried breath. Let the bright pieces drift away now. The pearls and drums, the purple sails, the quick eyes that never missed a ledger line. Let the heavier pieces settle gently, the quiet rooms, the small hands of children tucked under a mother's robe, the careful stitches of coal in a mirror lit by one steady lamp. Whatever history argues, it does so far from here. In this moment, names soften, edges blur, and the river simply turns, faithful to its own patient path. Imagine the library's colonnade at midnight. Cool stone, a pool reflecting a slice of moon, a reed pen set down at last. The scrolls are rolled. The wax has cooled. Perfume thins to a pleasant memory. Even the statues appear kinder in the dim. You walk past a bowl of figs, past a folded robe, past a door that leads only to quiet, and you feel the gentle relief of tasks completed, of voices dimming, of a story content to rest. You are only breath and heartbeat now, rising and falling, an easy tide along a familiar shore. Picture a small lamp beside your bed, its flame shrinking to a calm golden dot. The room grows soft around it, like linen, like water, like the last good page of a book that closes itself. Down you go, slow and certain, with the river, with the night, with the memory of a queen who knew when to whisper and when to sleep.